Hello everyone, and welcome back to Sleep Theories. Before we dive into tonight's tale, I hope you're all having a wonderful day, wherever you are in the world. I'm grateful you've chosen to spend some time with us. If you're new here, please consider subscribing to Sleep Theories for more stories that blur the line between reality and the unknown. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. What conspiracy theories or unexplained phenomena would you like us to explore next? And after you've heard tonight's story about the black-eyed children, let me know what you think about this particular mystery. Are they interdimensional beings, government experiments, or something else entirely? Your theories and insights help shape our future episodes. Now let's begin our journey into the desert town of Argus, New Mexico, where the boundary between dimensions grows thin, and some invitations should never be accepted. The rental car's GPS had stopped working 20 miles outside of Argus, New Mexico, leaving Gavin locked to navigate the final stretch using a paper map that seemed older than the desert itself. The road stretched endlessly through red sand and scrub brush, punctuated only by the occasional rusted fence post or sun-bleached billboard advertising businesses that had likely closed decades ago. At 32, Gavin had grown accustomed to the isolation that came with his work as a sound engineer for government contractors. His specialty in acoustic anomalies had taken him to some of the most remote locations on Earth, but something about this particular assignment felt different. The recruiter from Orion Systems had been unusually vague about the details, mentioning only that they needed someone with his specific expertise for a noise mapping project in the desert. The town of Argus appeared suddenly, rising from the desert like a mirage made real. A weathered sign proclaimed a population of 847, though Gavin suspected that number was optimistic. The buildings were low and sun-baked, their paint peeling in strips that fluttered in the constant wind. Main Street consisted of a gas station, a diner with a flickering neon sign, and a handful of shops that appeared to be closed despite the early afternoon hour. What struck Gavin immediately was the silence. In his line of work he had developed an acute sensitivity to ambient sound, and Argus was wrong. Small towns typically buzzed with the white noise of daily life, air conditioning units, distant conversations, the hum of electrical infrastructure. Here, the silence was so complete, it seemed to press against his eardrums like a physical weight. He pulled into the parking lot of the Sunset Motel, a single-story building that looked like it had been frozen in time since the 1960s. The desk clerk, a woman in her 50s with prematurely grey hair, barely looked up when he entered. She slid a key across the counter without a word, her eyes never quite meeting his. "Quiet town," Gavin ventured, hoping to make conversation. The woman's hand paused on the register. "Keeps to itself," she said finally, then turned away as if the conversation was over. Gavin's room was clean but sparse, with a single bed, a small table, and a window that looked out onto the desert. The air conditioner wheezed to life when he turned it on, providing the first familiar sound he'd heard since arriving. He unpacked his equipment, sensitive microphones, spectrum analyzers, and a laptop loaded with audio processing software. Tomorrow he would begin work at the facility, but tonight he wanted to acclimate to the local acoustic environment. As evening approached, Gavin walked through the town centre, noting the conspicuous absence of people. Occasionally he glimpsed a figure through a window or caught the flutter of a curtain, but no one emerged to greet him. The few residents he did encounter on the street moved with purpose, heads down, avoiding eye contact. Their behaviour reminded him of prey animals, constantly alert for predators. The diner was open, staffed by a teenage girl who took his order in monosyllables and served him a surprisingly good burger and fries. The only other customer was an elderly man who sat in the corner booth, nursing a cup of coffee and staring out at the darkening desert. When Gavin nodded in greeting, the man simply turned away. By 9 o'clock, the streets were completely empty. Gavin returned to his motel room and set up his equipment to record the nighttime ambient sound. The levels were unnaturally low, registering barely above the threshold of detection. Even more unusual, the frequency distribution was flat, lacking the typical variations that characterized natural environments. He was reviewing the initial recordings when he heard the knock. 3 soft raps on his door, perfectly spaced and unnaturally precise. Gavin glanced at his watch. 11:47 p.m. He approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. 2 children stood on the small concrete porch, a boy and a girl who appeared to be around 10 years old. They wore ordinary clothes, jeans and t-shirts that seemed too clean for children playing in the desert. "Can I help you?" Gavin called through the door. "We need to use your phone," the girl said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the typical inflections of childhood. "Our parents are worried." Gavin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night. Something about the children's presence set every instinct on high alert. He had no rational reason to refuse them. They were just kids who needed help, but every fibre of his being screamed danger. "There's a payphone at the gas station," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's broken," the boy replied in the same monotone as his companion. "We've been walking for hours. Please, we just need to make one call." Gavin pressed his eye to the peephole again, studying the children more carefully. They stood perfectly still, not shifting their weight or fidgeting as normal children would. Their faces were pale, almost luminous in the dim light from the motel's parking lot fixtures. Then he saw their eyes. Black. Completely black, from corner to corner, like pools of ink in their pale faces. No iris, no pupil, no reflection of light. Just endless darkness that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the artificial illumination. Gavin stumbled backward from the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. The children continued to stand there, patient and still, as if they could wait forever. "Please," the girl said again, "we just want to come in." The temperature in the room began to drop. Gavin could see his breath forming small clouds in the air. The windows began to fog over, and frost started to form on the glass of water he'd left on the nightstand. "I can't help you," Gavin said, backing further into the room. "You need to leave." Silence stretched for long minutes. Then, without another word, the children turned and walked away, their footsteps making no sound on the concrete. As they disappeared into the darkness, the temperature in the room gradually returned to normal. Gavin spent the rest of the night wide awake, his recording equipment running continuously. The audio files would later show something that defied explanation. For the 30 minutes the children had been present, all ambient sound had ceased completely. The desert, the motel, even the air conditioning unit had fallen silent, as if the world itself had been holding its breath. The Orion System facility was located 15 miles north of Argus, accessible only by an unmarked dirt road that wound through increasingly desolate terrain. Gavin arrived at 7 a.m. sharp, his nerves still frayed from the previous night's encounter. The facility itself was unremarkable, a cluster of prefabricated buildings surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. A simple sign read, "Authorized personnel only." The security guard at the gate, a middle-aged man named Rodriguez, was notably more talkative than the townspeople. He examined Gavin's credentials with professional efficiency while maintaining a friendly demeanour. "First time in Argus?" Rodriguez asked, handing back the ID badge. "Yes, and hopefully not the last," Gavin replied, attempting humour while studying the guard's reaction. Rodriguez's smile faltered slightly. "Gets easier after a while. The quiet, I mean. Some people take to it, others..." He shrugged. "Others don't stay long." Inside the main building, Gavin was greeted by Dr. Sarah Chen, the project director. She was a woman in her 40s with steel-grey hair and the kind of intense focus that came from years of classified work. She led him through a series of security checkpoints, each requiring biometric scans and increasingly complex authorization codes. "The acoustic mapping project is more complex than we initially outlined," Dr. Chen explained as they walked down a corridor lined with blast-resistant doors. "We're investigating frequency anomalies in a network of underground tunnels that were part of a decommissioned missile silo complex. The readings we're getting don't match any known acoustic signatures." They descended in an elevator that seemed to drop far deeper than the building's exterior would suggest. When the doors opened, Gavin found himself in a control room that looked like something from a space mission. Banks of monitors displayed waveforms, frequency analyses, and real-time seismic data. 3 technicians worked at various stations, their faces illuminated by the glow of their screens. "This is where you'll be working, Doctor," Chen said, gesturing to a sophisticated console equipped with the most advanced audio processing equipment Gavin had ever seen. "We've been monitoring the tunnel system for 6 months, and the anomalies are becoming more frequent and more pronounced." She handed him a thick folder labelled Project Silent Ward Audio Analysis Phase. The classification marking at the top was higher than anything Gavin had seen in his previous contracts. "The tunnels extend for miles beneath the desert," Dr. Chen continued. They were built in the 1960s as part of a missile defence system that was never fully activated. When the military abandoned the site, they sealed most of the access points, but we've maintained monitoring stations throughout the network. Gavin spent the morning familiarising himself with the equipment and reviewing the existing data. The acoustic anomalies were unlike anything in his experience. Portions of the recording seemed to play in reverse, creating an unsettling sensation that time itself was flowing backward. Other segments contained frequencies that shouldn't exist, tones that registered on the equipment but seemed to bypass normal auditory processing. His colleague, Alana Suresh, arrived around noon. She was a signal processing specialist with a background in both civilian and military applications. Her manner was professional but guarded, and Gavin noticed she kept glancing at the monitors as if expecting something to appear. "How long have you been working on this project?" Gavin asked during a brief break. 3 months, Alana replied. "Long enough to know that what we're recording down there isn't natural." She lowered her voice. "And long enough to know that asking too many questions isn't advisable." That afternoon they conducted a live monitoring session of the deepest tunnels. The audio feed crackled with static, then suddenly cleared to reveal something that made Gavin's blood run cold. Whispers, barely audible but unmistakably human, seemed to emerge from the depths of the earth. The voices spoke in languages he didn't recognise, but the tone was unmistakably urgent, almost pleading. "Are you recording this?" he asked Alana. She nodded, her face pale. "It's been happening more frequently. The linguistic analysis team says some of the voices are speaking in dead languages, dialects that haven't been used for centuries." The whispers faded, replaced by a low-frequency hum that seemed to resonate through the building structure. Gavin felt it in his bones, a vibration that triggered an instinctive fear response. Several of the other technicians removed their headphones, unable to tolerate the sound. As the day progressed, Gavin began to notice irregularities in the data itself. Files would appear and disappear from the server without explanation. Timestamps were inconsistent, sometimes showing recordings from dates that hadn't occurred yet. When he mentioned these discrepancies to Dr. Chen, she simply noted them in her log and moved on. The most disturbing discovery came at the end of the day. While reviewing the audio files, Gavin found a segment that contained his own voice, speaking words he had never uttered. "The children are waiting. The door must be opened." He immediately called Alana over to verify what he was hearing. Her face went ashen as she listened to the recording. "That's impossible," she whispered. "The microphones in the tunnels are miles away. There's no way they could have picked up your voice from here." "Unless," Gavin said slowly, "the sound isn't coming from the tunnels at all." That evening, as Gavin prepared to leave the facility, Alana approached him with a desperate expression. "I need to tell you something," she said, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "The children you saw last night, the ones with the black eyes, I've seen them too. They came to my house 2 weeks ago." Gavin felt a chill of recognition. "What did you do?" "I didn't let them in, but it was the hardest thing I've ever done. Every instinct was screaming at me to help them, to invite them inside. They stood there for hours, just waiting. When they finally left, I found this." She showed him a photograph taken through her window, 2 children walking away from her house, but their shadows were wrong. Where their shadows should have been, there were only pools of absolute darkness, as if they were holes cut out of reality itself. "They're not children," Alana said. "I've been researching using the classified databases. There are reports going back decades, always the same description. Black eyes, monotone voices, and they always ask to come in. People who let them in, they're never the same afterward." Gavin looked at the photograph again, noting the timestamp, 2:17 a.m. "What do you think they are?" "Threshold Guardians," Alana replied. "That's what the old files call them. They're testing something. Maybe our will to resist, maybe our ability to maintain the barrier between worlds. But whatever they are, they're not from here." As Gavin drove back to Argus that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, but shadows seemed to move independently of the sparse vegetation. When he reached his motel room, he carefully checked all the windows and doors before setting up his recording equipment. The children didn't return that night, but the audio files would later reveal something almost as disturbing. the sound of footsteps circling the motel, footsteps that made no impression in the desert sand. The breakthrough came on Gavin's third day at the facility. While Dr. Chen was away for a security briefing, Gavin discovered a terminal in an unused corner of the control room. The computer was ancient by modern standards, its CRT monitor flickering with the distinctive green glow of obsolete technology. Most importantly, it wasn't connected to the main network, which meant it had escaped the routine data purges that seemed to affect the newer systems. The terminal required a password, but Gavin's years of working with government contractors had taught him that older systems often retained default credentials. After several attempts, he gained access using a combination that had been standard for military installations in the 1980s. The file directory contained folders with names that sent a chill down his spine: BEC Encounters, Dimensional Bleed Analysis, and Project Silent Ward, Historical Data. He opened the Historical Data folder first, revealing a collection of documents that painted a picture far more disturbing than anything he had imagined. The earliest files dated back to 1963, just 2 years after the missile silo complex had been constructed. The initial reports were mundane, describing routine maintenance and security procedures, but by 1965 the tone began to change. Personnel reported unusual acoustic phenomena, voices in empty tunnels, equipment malfunctions during periods of electromagnetic anomalies, and most disturbing of all, the first recorded encounter with what the files termed BEC entities, black-eyed children. The clinical language of the reports couldn't mask the terror of the encounters. A security guard named Thomas Mitchell described 2 children who appeared at the facility's main gate at 3 a.m, claiming they were lost and needed help. When Mitchell refused to let them pass the security checkpoint, they stood motionless for 6 hours, never blinking, never moving, until the sunrise caused them to simply fade away. Similar reports followed with increasing frequency. The entities always appeared as children, always requested entry, and always displayed the same characteristics: pale skin, monotone voices, and completely black eyes. Personnel who encountered them reported feeling an overwhelming compulsion to comply with their requests, as if their will was being suppressed by some external force. The most chilling document was dated March 15th, 1967. Staff Sergeant Rebecca Holbrook had been working the night shift when 2 children appeared at her post. Unlike previous encounters, Holbrook had briefly opened the door to speak with them directly. The report filed by her supervisor described the aftermath. Sergeant Holbrook was found at her post the following morning in a state of complete catatonia. Medical examination revealed no physical injuries, but her pupils were completely dilated and showed no response to light. EEG readings indicated minimal brain activity, though she remained technically conscious. Most disturbing, when examined by ophthalmologists, her eyes appeared to be completely black, similar to the entities she'd encountered. Holbrook had died 3 days later, her body simply shutting down as if her life force had been drained away. The BSC encounters continued throughout the 1970s and 1980s, with the military documenting each incident with increasing sophistication. By the 1990s, the reports began to reference Project Silent Ward, a classified program designed to study what researchers termed dimensional bleed events. The project files revealed a truth that challenged everything Gavin thought he knew about reality. The entities weren't ghosts or extraterrestrial visitors. They were interdimensional beings, scouts from a parallel reality that existed alongside our own. The desert region around Argus was what the researchers called a thin spot, a location where the barrier between dimensions was naturally weak. The black-eyed children were projection entities, unable to fully manifest in our reality without being specifically invited across the threshold. They required conscious permission from a human being to complete their transition from their dimension to ours. Once invited, they became anchors, allowing other entities to follow. But the most disturbing revelation was yet to come. In 1987, the US government had made contact with the entity's intelligence network. The beings had offered a bargain. In exchange for allowing a limited number of pass-through events, they would provide advanced technology based on interdimensional physics. The technology they offered was revolutionary. Instantaneous communication across vast distances, energy sources that defied conventional physics, and most intriguingly, the ability to transmit data through dimensional barriers. The government had accepted the bargain. Project Silent Ward wasn't just a research program, it was a management protocol. The facility at Argus was designed to monitor and control the dimensional bleed events, ensuring that the entity's incursions remained within agreed-upon parameters. The acoustic anomalies Gavin had been hired to investigate were actually dimensional harmonics, the sound signature of reality itself being stretched and manipulated. The residents of Argus were part of the program, willing or unwilling participants in an ongoing experiment. Those who allowed the children entry became conduits, human receivers for interdimensional transmissions. The data flowing through them was then captured by the facility's monitoring equipment and transmitted to research centres around the world. Gavin printed as many documents as he could before hearing footsteps in the corridor. He quickly closed the files and returned to his assigned workstation, but his mind was reeling from the implications of what he had discovered. The children who had visited his motel room weren't just random entities, they were part of a systematic program of interdimensional exploitation. When Dr. Chen returned from her briefing, she seemed different, more alert and watchful. She spent several minutes examining the computer workstations, as if checking for signs of unauthorized access. "Is everything all right?" Gavin asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Security protocols," she replied curtly. "We've had concerns about data integrity. All personnel are required to submit to additional screening procedures." That afternoon, Gavin noticed increased security presence at the facility. Armed guards were stationed at checkpoints that had previously been unmanned, and several areas that had been accessible were now restricted. When he asked Alana about the changes, she pulled him aside and whispered urgently. "They know someone's been accessing the old files," she said. 3 people have been transferred out in the last week, officially for security violations. Unofficially, they started asking too many questions." "What kind of question?" "About the children, about what happens to people who let them in, about why the government is allowing this to continue." Gavin felt a growing sense of urgency. If the facility administrators suspected his unauthorized access, he might not have much time before he was removed from the project. But more than that, he was beginning to understand that the residents of Argus were trapped in a nightmare that most of them didn't even recognize. That night, he made his decision. He would document everything he had learned and find a way to expose the truth, even if it meant ending his career and possibly his life. The people of Argus deserved to know what was being done to them, and the world deserved to understand the true nature of the interdimensional entities that were slowly infiltrating our reality. As he prepared to leave the facility, Dr. Chen approached him with a thin smile. "Mr. Locke, I hope you're finding the work engaging. This project is very important to national security, and we value team members who understand the importance of discretion." The warning was clear, but Gavin simply nodded and wished her a good evening. As he walked to his car, he noticed that the shadows seemed deeper than usual, and the desert wind carried sounds that shouldn't exist. Whispers in languages he didn't recognize, and the distant laughter of children who should have been asleep. The research consumed Gavin's every waking moment. Back in his motel room, he spread the printed documents across the small table and began to piece together the full scope of the government's bargain with the interdimensional entities. The more he learned, the more horrified he became. The blood signature was what the researchers called the biological marker left behind when humans interacted with the BEC entities. According to the classified medical reports, direct contact with the beings resulted in measurable changes to human physiology. Brain scans showed altered neural pathways, particularly in regions associated with willpower and self-preservation. Blood work revealed the presence of proteins that didn't exist in baseline human samples, compounds that seemed to serve as biological transmitters. Most disturbing were the psychological profiles. Subjects who had been exposed to the entities showed a progressive deterioration of independent thought. They became increasingly compliant, responding to subtle suggestions with mechanical obedience. Their memories became fragmented, with large gaps appearing in their personal histories. Within weeks of exposure, many subjects would simply disappear, walking into the desert and never returning. The government researchers had documented these effects meticulously, treating human subjects like laboratory specimens. The clinical detachment of the reports was more chilling than the most graphic horror story. These were real people, residents of Argus and surrounding communities, who had been systematically exposed to interdimensional entities for the sake of scientific advancement. Gavin was deep in his research when his phone rang. It was Rodriguez, the security guard from the facility. "I probably shouldn't be calling you," Rodriguez said, his voice tense with anxiety. "But I thought you should know. They found Alana." "Found her? What do you mean?" "She's alive, but..." Rodriguez paused, struggling for words. "She's not responding to anyone. They took her to the medical facility. Her eyes, Mr. Locke, they're completely black." Gavin felt his blood turn to ice. "When did this happen?" "Sometime last night. A neighbour called the police when she didn't show up for work. They found her in her living room sitting in a chair staring at nothing. She's been like that for hours." After hanging up, Gavin sat in stunned silence. Alana had been his only ally at the facility, the only person who understood the true nature of what they were investigating. If she had been compromised, it meant the entities were accelerating their activities. He drove to Alana's house, a small adobe structure on the outskirts of Argus. Police cars were parked outside, their red and blue lights casting eerie shadows across the desert landscape. Through the window he could see several figures in hazmat suits moving around inside. A deputy sheriff approached as Gavin got out of his car. "Areas restricted," the deputy said. "Potential contamination hazard." "I work with Miss Suresh," Gavin explained. "What kind of contamination?" The deputy studied him carefully. "Are you at the government facility?" When Gavin nodded, the deputy's demeanour changed. "Dr. Chen is inside. She can brief you." The interior of Alana's house was a study in controlled chaos. Men in protective gear were collecting samples from every surface, while others operated sophisticated scanning equipment. Dr. Chen stood in the centre of the living room, directing the operation with clinical efficiency. "Mr. Locke," she said, without looking up from her tablet, "I'm afraid Miss Suresh has suffered a psychological breakdown. She's been transferred to a specialised facility for treatment." "What happened to her?" "That's classified," Dr. Chen replied. "However, I can tell you that she appears to have had an encounter with the entities we've been monitoring. She was found in a state of complete catatonia, similar to historical cases we've documented." Gavin looked around the room, noting the absence of any signs of struggle. Everything was neat and orderly, as if Alana had simply sat down and waited for something to happen. "How did the entities get inside?" he asked. Dr. Chen finally looked at him, her eyes cold and calculating. "That's what we're trying to determine. Our preliminary investigation suggests that she may have invited them in voluntarily." "That's impossible. She knew what they were, what they could do." "People under extreme stress often make poor decisions," Dr. Chen replied. "The isolation, the nature of our work, the constant exposure to anomalous phenomena, it can break down psychological barriers." One of the technicians approached with a device that looked like a sophisticated metal detector. "We found the source of the frequency anomaly," he reported. "It's in the bedroom." They followed him to Alana's bedroom, where he pointed to a small object on the nightstand. It was perfectly black, about the size of a smartphone, with a surface that seemed to absorb light. The device emitted a barely audible hum that seemed to resonate in Gavin's bones. "What is it?" Gavin asked. "An interdimensional resonance generator," Dr. Chen explained. "The entities use them to maintain coherence in our reality. When activated, they create a localized field that allows for extended manifestation." "And Alana had one in her bedroom?" "She didn't have it, they left it behind. It's a calling card, a way of marking territory they consider claimed." Gavin stared at the device, feeling a growing sense of dread. "Are you saying the entities have claimed Alana?" "I'm saying that Ms. Suresh is no longer capable of independent thought. The neural pathways that define individual consciousness have been restructured. She's become a receiver, a biological antenna for interdimensional transmissions." The clinical language couldn't mask the horror of what Dr. Chen was describing. Alana had been transformed into a living tool, her humanity stripped away to serve the entity's purposes. "This is what happens to everyone who lets them in?" Gavin asked. "Eventually, yes. The process can take days or weeks, depending on the individual's psychological resilience, but the outcome is always the same." As they left the house, Gavin noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the dust beside the front door, there were 2 sets of small footprints leading away from the house. The prints were perfectly preserved, as if the desert wind had deliberately avoided disturbing them. "The children," he said, pointing to the tracks. Dr. Chen followed his gaze and nodded grimly. "They always leave evidence of their visits. We believe it's intentional, a way of marking their territory and warning others." That evening, Gavin sat in his motel room, staring at the documents spread across his table. The weight of what he had learned was crushing. The government wasn't just tolerating the entity's activities, they were actively facilitating them, using the residents of Argus as unwilling test subjects in an interdimensional experiment. But what terrified him most was the growing realization that he was being watched. Throughout the day, he had noticed subtle signs, cars that seemed to follow him, figures that appeared in his peripheral vision, and most disturbing of all, the feeling that unseen eyes were constantly observing his every move. His research had made him a target, and he suspected that his time was running out. The entities knew he was investigating them, and they were planning their next move. The question was whether he could expose the truth before they silenced him permanently. As if summoned by his thoughts, 3 soft knocks sounded on his door. Gavin's heart began to race. He approached the door slowly, his hand trembling as he reached for the peephole. 2 children stood on the porch, the same boy and girl he had encountered before, but this time they weren't alone. Behind them, barely visible in the darkness, stood a tall figure in a dark suit. The man's face was obscured by shadows, but Gavin could see his eyes, completely black, just like the children's. "We need to talk," the girl said, her voice carrying a new authority. "About Miss Suresh. About what you've discovered." The man stepped forward, and Gavin could see him more clearly. He was pale and gaunt, with sharp features that seemed somehow wrong, as if his face was a mask that didn't quite fit properly. "You have questions," the man said, his voice deeper than the children's but equally monotone. "We have answers, but first you must invite us in." Gavin backed away from the door, his mind racing. The entities weren't just making random contact, they were responding to his investigation, acknowledging that he had uncovered their secrets. But accepting their invitation to talk would mean crossing the same threshold that had doomed Alana. "I'm not letting you in," he said firmly. The temperature in the room began to drop and frost started forming on the windows. The entity's presence was affecting the local environment, bending reality around their dimensional intrusion. "You cannot stop what has already begun," the man said. "The threshold grows thinner. Soon, invitation will no longer be necessary." The implications of his words hit Gavin like a physical blow. The entities weren't just infiltrating through invited access. They were working to weaken the dimensional barrier itself. The facility at Argus wasn't just monitoring their activities, it was helping them establish a permanent foothold in our reality. "What do you want?" Gavin called through the door. "Understanding," the girl replied. "Your species fears what it does not comprehend. We offer knowledge, partnership, evolution." "At what cost?" "Individual consciousness is an inefficient model," the man explained. "We offer unity, purpose, freedom from the chaos of independent thought." The entity's version of paradise was a nightmare of collective consciousness, where individual will was subsumed into a greater whole. They saw humanity not as a species to be conquered, but as a resource to be optimized, converted into biological receivers for their interdimensional network. "The answer is no," Gavin said. "I won't let you in, and I won't stop investigating what you're doing here." The silence stretched for several minutes, broken only by the increasing hum of the resonance field the entities were generating. Finally, the man spoke again. Ms. Suresh thought she could resist as well. She believed her knowledge would protect her. But knowledge without wisdom is merely information, and information can be redirected. The threat was clear. The entities had somehow forced Alana to invite them in, overriding her conscious resistance through means Gavin couldn't understand. If they could do it to her, they could do it to him. Your investigation ends now, the man continued. Return to your work, complete your assignment, and forget what you have learned. This is your only warning. The footsteps receded, but Gavin didn't trust that the entities had actually left. He spent the night wide awake, his recording equipment running continuously, documenting every sound and frequency anomaly. The audio files would later reveal that the entities had remained in the area for hours, their presence detectable only through subtle distortions in the ambient sound field. By morning, Gavin had made his decision. He couldn't complete his assignment and pretend nothing had happened. Too many people had already been sacrificed to the entity's agenda. It was time to expose the truth, regardless of the personal cost. But first, he needed to understand exactly what the government hoped to gain from their bargain with interdimensional beings. The answer came from an unexpected source. As Gavin prepared to leave his motel room the next morning, he found an elderly man waiting by his car. The stranger was tall and gaunt, with silver hair and eyes that held the weight of terrible knowledge. Despite his age, he moved with the careful precision of someone who had spent years looking over his shoulder. "Mr. Locke," the man said, extending a weathered hand. "My name is Thorn Rilke. I believe we need to talk." Gavin studied the stranger carefully. There was something familiar about his name, though he couldn't place where he might have heard it. "I'm not sure what we'd have to discuss," Gavin replied cautiously. "Project Silent Ward, the interdimensional entities, the government's bargain with beings from another reality." Thorn's voice was steady, but Gavin could see the tension in his posture. "I know because I was there when it began." The name suddenly clicked. Gavin had seen it in the historical documents. Thorn Rilke, listed as a test subject in the Utah facility, one of the few people who had survived direct contact with the entities and retained his sanity. "You were in the files," Gavin said. "The 1979 incident." Thorn nodded grimly. "I was a communications specialist with the Air Force, assigned to a facility that was conducting atmospheric research. What they were really doing was attempting to establish contact with the entities. I was one of the volunteers for the first controlled exposure." He pulled up his shirt sleeve, revealing a series of scars that formed an intricate pattern on his forearm. The marks looked like they had been burned into his skin, but they moved slightly, as if the tissue itself was alive. "This is what direct contact does to you," Thorn said, rolling his sleeve back down. "The marks never fade, never stop moving. They're a reminder of what I became, however briefly, when I allowed them to enter my mind." Gavin stared at the spot where the scars had been. "But you escaped. You retained your consciousness." "Barely, and only because of a malfunction in their equipment. The resonance field collapsed before the conversion process could complete. 37 other test subjects weren't so lucky." Thorn's eyes grew distant with memory. "I watched them transform, watched their personalities dissolve into something collective and alien. They looked human, but behind their eyes was something vast and hungry." "What did the government gain from the bargain?" Thorn gestured toward a small diner across the street. "Let's continue this conversation somewhere less exposed. The entities have excellent hearing, and they've been monitoring this town for decades." Inside the diner, Thorn ordered coffee with hands that shook slightly. The waitress was the same teenage girl who had served Gavin before, but now he noticed the way she moved, too precisely, with none of the casual inefficiency of normal human behaviour. "She's one of them," Thorn said quietly once they were alone. "Not an entity, but converted. Her consciousness has been restructured to serve as a receiver." Gavin studied the girl more carefully. Her movements were indeed mechanical, and when she turned toward their table, he could see that her pupils were larger than normal, though not completely black. "How many?" "In Argus, maybe a third of the population. The process is gradual, designed to avoid suspicion. People change slowly, becoming more compliant, more isolated. Eventually they stop being people at all." Thorn pulled out a manila folder filled with photographs and documents. "The technology they provided in exchange is revolutionary. Quantum communication arrays that can transmit data instantaneously across any distance. Energy sources that tap into dimensional differentials. computing systems that process information using interdimensional matrices. The photographs showed devices that looked like abstract sculptures, all curved surfaces and impossible angles. The technical specifications were beyond Gavin's understanding, but the implications were clear. "They're terraforming us," Gavin said, the realization hitting him with sickening clarity. "Not our planet, our species." Exactly. They don't want to invade in any conventional sense. They want to convert us into extensions of their collective consciousness. Humanity becomes their biological infrastructure in this dimension. And the government agreed to this? Thorne's laugh was bitter. The government thinks they're managing the process, controlling the rate of conversion. They believe they can limit the entity's access, use the technology to advance human civilization while keeping the conversion process contained. But that's not what's happening. The entities are patient. They've been working on this for decades, slowly expanding their influence, converting more people, weakening the dimensional barriers. Each person who accepts them makes the next conversion easier. Eventually they won't need invitations at all. Gavin thought about the man in the dark suit who had accompanied the children the night before. His threat that invitation would soon become unnecessary suddenly took on new meaning. How long do we have? Years, maybe decades, but the process is accelerating. The facility here at Argus is one of several around the world. Each one serves as an anchor point, a stable portal between dimensions. When they have enough anchor points, they'll be able to manifest permanently in our reality. Then we have to stop them. Thorne shook his head. "I've been trying for 40 years. Every time I've attempted to expose the program, I've been discredited, silenced, or forced to run. The entities have allies throughout the government, people who've been converted or who believe they're working towards some greater good. So what do you suggest? Document everything. Create a record that can survive even if we don't. Upload it to distributed networks, hidden servers, anywhere they can't easily erase it. And whatever you do, never let them in. Once they have access to your mind, even briefly, you become another tool in their arsenal." Thorne stood to leave, but paused at their table. "There's something else you need to know. The children who've been visiting you, they're not random scouts. They're specifically targeting you because of your investigation. They know you've uncovered their secrets, and they're going to keep trying until they succeed. What happens if I keep refusing them? They'll escalate, send more powerful entities, create psychological pressure, maybe threaten people you care about. But if you give in, if you let them in even once, it's over. You become one of them, and everything you've learned becomes part of their knowledge base." After Thorne left, Gavin sat alone in the diner, processing the enormity of what he had learned. The scope of the conspiracy was beyond anything he had imagined. This wasn't just a government cover-up. It was a systematic plan to transform humanity into something else entirely. The converted waitress approached with a coffee refill, moving with that same mechanical precision. When she leaned over to pour, Gavin noticed that her shadow seemed wrong, too dark and too deep, as if it extended into dimensions he couldn't perceive. "More coffee?" she asked, her voice carrying subtle harmonics that seemed designed to induce compliance. "No, thank you," Gavin replied, standing abruptly. As he walked toward the door, he heard her speak again, though her lips didn't move. "You cannot run forever, Mr. Locke. We are patient, but our patience has limits." Gavin drove back to the facility with his mind racing. He had to find a way to document everything and get the information to the outside world before the entities could stop him. But first, he needed to understand the full scope of their technological capabilities. The facility was buzzing with activity when Gavin arrived. Additional security personnel had been stationed at every checkpoint, and the atmosphere was tense with barely contained urgency. Dr. Chen intercepted him before he could reach his workstation. "Mr. Locke, we need to discuss your security clearance," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "There have been some irregularities in your access logs." Gavin's heart sank. They had discovered his unauthorized use of the old terminal. What kind of irregularities? System records show that someone accessed classified historical files using outdated credentials. Since you're the only new personnel with the technical knowledge to bypass our security protocols, we need to conduct a thorough review. 2 security guards flanked Dr. Chen. their hands resting casually on their sidearms. The message was clear. Cooperation was mandatory. "I understand," Gavin said. "What do you need from me?" "Complete your current assignment and prepare for transfer. Your expertise is needed at another facility, one better suited to your security classification level." It was a polite way of saying he was being removed from the project. Once they transferred him, any chance of exposing the truth would disappear. He would be isolated, monitored, and probably subjected to the same conversion process that had claimed Alana. Gavin spent the day working on his acoustic analysis, but his real focus was on copying as much data as possible to portable storage devices. He used a technique he had learned in previous government contracts, embedding files within the metadata of innocuous audio recordings. To casual inspection, the files would appear to be routine sound samples. Only someone who knew what to look for would find the hidden documents. As the day progressed, he noticed increasing surveillance. Security cameras that had previously been stationary now tracked his movements. Personnel who had never shown interest in his work suddenly found reasons to observe his activities. The walls were closing in. During his lunch break, Gavin managed to upload several files to a distributed storage network using a satellite internet connection that bypassed the facility's monitoring systems. He embedded the data in seemingly random audio files and scattered them across multiple servers. Even if the entities discovered some of the uploads, others would survive. The most important document was a comprehensive summary of everything he had learned. The government's bargain with interdimensional entities, the conversion process that transformed humans into biological receivers, and the long-term plan to terraform humanity itself. He titled it The Threshold Pact, and included detailed instructions for anyone who might find it. As evening approached, Dr. Chen informed him that his transfer would take effect immediately. A transport team would escort him to a facility in Nevada, where he would undergo debriefing and reassignment. "It's nothing personal," she said, though her eyes suggested otherwise. "You're simply too valuable to risk in a field environment." Gavin knew it was a lie. The Nevada facility was probably where they conducted the conversion process on personnel who had learned too much. He would be transformed into another receiver, his knowledge absorbed into the entity's collective consciousness. He made his final preparations carefully, copying the last of the critical files to multiple storage devices. His plan was simple: appear to cooperate with the transfer while looking for an opportunity to escape. Once outside the facility, he could upload the remaining files and try to reach someone in the media or academic community who might believe his story. But the entities had other plans. As Gavin left the facility that evening, he noticed that the desert was eerily quiet. Even the constant wind had died away, leaving the landscape in perfect stillness. The silence was so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. His motel room had been cleaned and prepared for his departure, his belongings packed in government-issued boxes. But sitting on the small table where he had conducted his research was a single black device, identical to the one they had found in Alana's bedroom. The resonance generator was already active, filling the room with subsonic frequencies that seemed to bypass his conscious mind and speak directly to his nervous system. Gavin felt his willpower beginning to erode, replaced by a growing compulsion to simply sit down and wait. He forced himself to move, grabbing the storage devices and heading for the door, but as he reached for the handle, 3 soft knocks echoed through the room. "Mr. Locke," came the familiar voice of the girl. "We need to come in." This time there was no request, no polite asking for permission. The voice carried an authority that seemed to resonate in his bones, compelling obedience at a cellular level. "Please open the door," the boy added. It's time for us to talk." Gavin pressed his back against the door, fighting the overwhelming urge to comply. The resonance generator was affecting his brain chemistry, flooding his system with neurochemicals that suppressed resistance and enhanced suggestibility. "You cannot fight us forever," came a third voice, the man in the dark suit. "Ms. Suresh discovered this. Your colleague Dr. Chen learned it years ago. Resistance only prolongs suffering. Dr. Chen was one of them." It explained her casual attitude toward the horrors documented in the files. a clinical detachment from human suffering. She had been converted long ago, transformed into a human overseer for the entity's agenda. "We offer unity," the girl continued, "freedom from the burden of individual consciousness. Your knowledge will become part of something greater, your existence given meaning beyond personal limitations." The temperature in the room continued to drop, and Gavin could see ice crystals forming on the windows. The entities were exerting massive energy to maintain their manifestation, bending local reality around their presence. "The process is inevitable," the man said. "Every human who learns our truth faces the same choice: join willingly, or be converted by force. Willing conversion preserves more of the original personality matrix. Forced conversion is less pleasant." Gavin closed his eyes and tried to focus on his breathing, using meditation techniques to counter the resonance generator's effects. He thought about Alana, sitting catatonic in some government facility while her consciousness was slowly dissolved. He thought about the residents of Argus, gradually losing their humanity without even realizing it. He thought about a future where the concept of individual thought became extinct. "No," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The door will open," the girl replied with absolute certainty. "If not tonight, then tomorrow. If not by choice, then by compulsion. The threshold weakens with each passing hour." Hours passed. The entities remained outside, their presence a constant pressure against his consciousness. The resonance generator continued its assault on his nervous system, and Gavin felt his resistance wearing away like sand before the tide. But he held on, focusing on a single thought. The files he had uploaded scattered across the digital landscape like seeds waiting to sprout. Even if he failed, even if they converted him, the truth would survive. Someone, somewhere, would find the evidence and understand what was happening. As dawn approached, the pressure suddenly lifted. The resonance generator fell silent, and the temperature in the room began to return to normal. Gavin cautiously approached the window and peered outside. The parking lot was empty, but written in the frost on his window in letters that seemed to glow with their own dark light was a simple message: "Soon." Gavin's time had run out. The transport team arrived at dawn. 3 men in black suits who moved with the same mechanical precision he had observed in the converted residents of Argus. They were polite but firm, making it clear that resistance would be futile. "Mr. Locke, we're here to escort you to your new assignment," the lead agent said. His eyes were normal, but something in his voice suggested he was no longer entirely human. As they loaded his belongings into their vehicle, Gavin managed to slip one of the storage devices into his shoe. It was a desperate gambit, but it represented his last chance to ensure the truth survived. The drive to the Nevada facility took 6 hours, winding through increasingly desolate terrain. The agents made no attempt at conversation, responding to his questions with monosyllabic answers or silence. As they travelled deeper into the desert, Gavin noticed that the radio began picking up strange signals, whispers in unknown languages, tones that seemed to originate from inside his own head. The facility, when it finally appeared, was far larger than the one at Argus. Multiple buildings spread across a vast complex with satellite dishes and transmission towers reaching toward the sky. It looked more like a telecommunications centre than a research facility, which Gavin realised was probably its true purpose. Dr. Marcus Webb, the facility director, greeted them at the security checkpoint. He was a thin man with prematurely grey hair and eyes that held the same terrible knowledge Gavin had seen in Thorn Rilke. "Mr. Locke, welcome to Station Echo," Dr. Webb said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "I trust your journey was comfortable." "What exactly happens here?" Gavin asked. "Integration," Dr. Webb replied. "We help personnel who have been exposed to classified information process their experiences in a safe, controlled environment. Think of it as a debriefing centre with therapeutic capabilities." The clinical language couldn't mask what this place really was: a conversion facility where humans were systematically transformed into receivers for the interdimensional network. They processed him through the standard procedures: medical examination, psychological evaluation, and assignment to quarters. His room was comfortable but sterile, with no windows and a door that locked from the outside. Most ominously, a resonance generator sat on the nightstand, its dark surface reflecting no light. The device helps with the adjustment process, Dr. Webb explained. It calibrates your neural pathways to receive interdimensional transmissions more efficiently. Most subjects find the experience quite peaceful. That evening, alone in his room with the resonance generator humming softly, Gavin activated the failsafe protocol he had built into his uploaded files. Using a simple code transmitted through the facility's own network, he triggered the release of all the documents he had hidden across the internet. The files began appearing on forums, academic databases, and social media platforms around the world. Most would be dismissed as science fiction or conspiracy theories, but some would reach people with the knowledge to understand their significance. Scientists, researchers, government whistleblowers, someone would recognize the truth and continue the investigation. His final message was the most important, a detailed warning about the black-eyed children and the invitation they sought. He embedded it in audio files, image metadata, and text documents, ensuring it would propagate across multiple platforms. The children are not what they seem. They are scouts from another dimension, seeking permission to enter our reality. They appear as children to trigger our protective instincts, but behind their black eyes lies an intelligence that views humanity as a resource to be harvested. Never invite them in. Never give them permission to enter your home, your mind, or your reality. They are patient, but they are not invincible. Resistance is possible, but it requires knowledge of what they truly are. The message included detailed instructions for recognizing the entities, defending against their psychological manipulation, and identifying converted humans. It also provided coordinates for facilities like Argus and Station Echo, urging readers to investigate these locations and expose the government's complicity. As Gavin completed his final upload, the resonance generator's frequency shifted. The new tone was more insistent, more invasive, and he felt his consciousness beginning to fragment. The conversion process had begun, but he had accomplished his mission. The truth was out there, scattered across the digital landscape like dandelion seeds in the wind. Some would find fertile ground, taking root in minds capable of understanding and acting on the information. His last coherent thought was a prayer that someone, somewhere, would heed his warning and find a way to stop the entities before it was too late. 3 days later, Gavin Locke was officially declared missing. The surveillance footage from his room showed him sitting peacefully as the conversion process progressed, his consciousness slowly dissolving into the collective network. By the end of the second day, his pupils had turned completely black. On the third morning, he simply walked out of the facility and into the desert, moving with the same mechanical precision that characterized all the converted. The security cameras tracked his progress until he disappeared beyond the perimeter fence. But the damage had already been done. Gavin's uploaded files began spreading across the internet, reaching researchers, journalists, and conspiracy theorists around the world. Most dismissed them as elaborate fiction, but some recognized the authenticity of the classified documents and began their own investigations. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a physicist at MIT, was one of the first to take the claims seriously. Her analysis of the acoustic data convinced her that the frequency anomalies were real, and she began organizing a team to investigate the Argus facility. James Morrison, an investigative journalist with a reputation for exposing government cover-ups, saw the story's potential and started tracking down personnel connected to Project Silent Ward. And in a small town in Oregon, Sarah Chen, a different Sarah Chen, unconnected to the project, read Gavin's warning just as 2 children with completely black eyes knocked on her door. She didn't let them in. The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. A traffic camera on a remote highway outside Station Echo captured something that would become the subject of intense debate among those who believed Gavin's story. The timestamp read 3:17 a.m. The image showed a figure walking down the empty road, barefoot and moving with unnatural precision. On either side of the figure, 2 children walked in perfect synchronization, their small hands clasped around the adult's larger ones. The figure was unmistakably Gavin Locke, but his eyes were pools of absolute darkness that seemed to absorb the camera's infrared illumination. His face was expressionless, devoid of any trace of the man who had once questioned the nature of reality and fought to preserve humanity's freedom. But perhaps most disturbing was what the enhancement software revealed when researchers analysed the image years later. The trio cast no shadows on the moonlit pavement, as if they existed in a space between dimensions, walking through our reality without truly being part of it. The photograph became known as the Threshold document, and it served as a stark reminder of what awaited those who opened their doors to the black-eyed children. Some who saw it reported experiencing nightmares for weeks afterward, dreams of children with dark eyes who stood patiently outside their homes, waiting for an invitation that must never come. Gavin Locke's story spread through underground networks and alternative research communities, becoming a modern legend that saved countless lives. His sacrifice had not been in vain. The truth had survived, and with it, humanity's chance to resist the entity's patient infiltration. The children still come to doors around the world, speaking in their monotone voices and asking for permission to enter. They appear at government facilities, suburban homes and remote research stations, always patient, always persistent. But now, some people know what they really are. And that knowledge, purchased with Gavin Locke's life and sanity, might just be enough to save our species from a fate worse than extinction. The loss of everything that makes us human. The Threshold Pact continues, but it no longer goes unchallenged. In the growing darkness between dimensions, a light of resistance still burns, fed by the courage of one man who refused to open the door, even when the cost of resistance was everything he held dear. The war for humanity's soul had begun, and the first victory belonged to those who understood a simple truth. Some invitations should never be accepted, no matter how innocently they are offered, no matter how compelling the voices that speak them. Never let them in, never open the door, the threshold must hold. The manuscript of David Rourke. Recovered from classified materials 1962 to 1963. My name is David Rourke, and I'm probably dead by the time you read this. If you're reading this at all, it means my niece found the hidden compartment in my basement wall, just like I told her to if I ever disappeared. I'm writing this in 1987, 25 years after the events I'm about to describe, and I still wake up in cold sweats, hearing that low-frequency hum that covered Johnston Atoll like a blanket of dread. I was 28 years old in 1962, a radar and telemetry specialist with the US Air Force, stationed at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. I had a top-secret clearance, which was pretty standard for someone in my position, but I'd never worked on anything more classified than routine missile tracking. That all changed on a Tuesday morning in June when Colonel Morrison called me into his office. "Rourke," he said, not looking up from a file marked with more classification stamps than I'd ever seen on a single document. "How's your family situation?" "Sir?" I asked, confused by the question. "Wife? Kids? Girlfriend? Anyone who'd miss you if you disappeared for a few months?" I shifted uncomfortably in my chair. "No, sir. Just divorced last year. No kids." "Good." He finally looked up and I noticed his eyes had the hollow look of someone who hadn't slept well in weeks. "Ever heard of Johnston Atoll?" "No, sir. Most people haven't. It's an island in the Pacific that officially doesn't exist. Except it does. And you're going there." He slid a folder across his desk. "Your new assignment. Read it. Memorize it. Then burn it. You leave tomorrow at 0600 hours. The folder contained a single sheet of paper with minimal information. Johnston Atoll, Pacific Ocean, grid reference classified, Operation Dominic, sub-project Glass Curtain, duration indefinite. My job description was listed as Atmospheric Radiation Telemetry Calibration Specialist, a title I'd never heard before and wasn't entirely sure I understood. "Sir, what exactly is atmospheric radiation telemetry calibration?" Colonel Morrison's jaw tightened. "You'll find out when you get there. And Rourke, whatever you see, whatever you hear, whatever you think you understand, you don't. Are we clear?" "Yes, sir. One more thing." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small device I didn't recognise. This is a dosimeter. You wear it at all times. When it starts clicking, you get underground. When it starts screaming, you pray. The flight to Johnston Atoll took 14 hours, including a refueling stop at Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii. I was the only passenger on a military transport plane, and the crew treated me like I was carrying a live bomb. No one spoke to me during the entire flight except to offer me a meal that tasted like cardboard and regret. As we approached Johnston Atoll, I pressed my face to the small window and got my first look at what would be my home for the next 18 months. The island was tiny, maybe 2 miles long and half a mile wide at its widest point, and appeared to be mostly airstrip and military buildings. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, a blue void that made me feel like we were landing on the edge of the world. The moment I stepped off the plane, I was hit by the oppressive heat and humidity of the Central Pacific. But there was something else in the air, a metallic taste that made my teeth ache, and a subtle vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The dosimeter on my belt clicked occasionally, which I assumed was normal background radiation. I was met by a man in civilian clothes who introduced himself as Dr. Reginald Hawthorne, project director for Glass Curtain. He was tall and thin, with prematurely grey hair, and the kind of pale skin that suggested he spent most of his time indoors. His handshake was firm but cold, and his eyes held the same hollow look I'd seen in Colonel Morrison. "Welcome to Johnston Atoll, Mr. Rourke," he said, leading me toward a jeep. "I trust your flight was comfortable?" "Yes, sir. Though I have to admit I'm still not entirely clear on what my job is here." Dr. Hawthorne glanced around nervously before answering. "Your job, Mr. Rourke, is to ensure that our atmospheric measurements are accurate during the upcoming tests. We're conducting research into the effects of high-altitude detonations on the upper atmosphere." Detonations? Nuclear detonations. We're going to be setting off atomic bombs in the sky, Mr. Rourke. Very high in the sky. As we drove across the island, I noticed several things that struck me as odd. First, there were far more personnel than I would have expected for a small research station. Easily over 1,000 people. Second, the equipment was unlike anything I'd seen before. Massive radar dishes pointed straight up at the sky, and there were instruments I couldn't identify scattered around the island like metallic mushrooms. But the strangest thing was the hangar. It was enormous, easily large enough to house a squadron of bombers, but it was completely windowless and surrounded by a double fence topped with razor wire. Guards with automatic weapons patrolled the perimeter, and I noticed that their uniforms bore no insignia I recognised. "What's in the hangar?" I asked. Dr. Hawthorne's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "That's not your concern, Mr. Rourke. Your job is telemetry calibration. I suggest you focus on that." My quarters were in a Quonset hut that I shared with 3 other technicians. Bobby Chen, an electronics specialist from San Francisco, Marcus Webb, a photographer from the Army Signal Corps, and Dr. James Kellerman, a physicist from the University of Chicago who'd been working on classified projects since the Manhattan Project. That first night, as we sat around a card table playing poker and drinking warm beer, I tried to get a feel for what we were really doing on this godforsaken island. "So what exactly are we testing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Bobby Chen exchanged a look with Marcus Webb before answering. "Officially, we're studying the effects of high-altitude nuclear detonations on radio communications and satellite systems. And unofficially?" Dr. Kellerman looked up from his cards. "Unofficially, we're trying to break something that shouldn't be broken." "What do you mean?" "Have you ever heard of the firmament, Mr. Rourke?" I shook my head. "It's mentioned in the Bible, in Genesis. And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. Most people interpret it as poetic language, but some of the boys upstairs think it might be more literal than that." "You're saying there's actually some kind of barrier above the earth?" "I'm saying," Dr. Kellerman said carefully, "that there are things about our atmosphere that we don't understand, things that don't show up in the textbooks, and we're going to find out what happens when you hit them with a nuclear bomb." The next morning I was awakened at 0500 hours by a loudspeaker crackling to life throughout the base. "All personnel, this is a drill. This is a drill. Code Glass Curtain is now in effect. All personnel report to assigned stations. Do not look at the sky. Repeat, do not look at the sky. I threw on my uniform and ran to the telemetry station, where Dr. Hawthorne was already setting up equipment with the frantic efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. "Is this really a drill?" I asked. "No," he said without looking up. "The real test is in 3 days. This is just to make sure everyone knows what to do when the sky starts falling." Over the next 3 days, I learned more about Operation Fishbowl than I ever wanted to know. The plan was to detonate a 1.4 megaton nuclear warhead 250 miles above the Earth's surface, higher than any nuclear weapon had ever been detonated before. The official reason was to study the effects on radio communications and to test whether nuclear weapons could be used to disable enemy satellites. But the more I listened to the conversations between the scientists and military officers, the more I realised that wasn't the whole story. They kept referring to vertical containment analysis and atmospheric penetration studies. They talked about barrier resistance and firmament interaction protocols. These weren't terms I'd ever heard in connection with nuclear testing. The most disturbing thing was the obsession with looking up. Everyone on the island had been given explicit instructions not to look at the sky during the detonation. We were told that the flash would be visible even through closed eyelids, and that looking directly at it could cause permanent blindness. But the way they talked about it suggested that blindness was the least of our concerns. "Whatever you do," Dr. Hawthorne told me on the morning of July 9th, "don't look up. Not during the detonation, not for 10 minutes after. Keep your eyes on your instruments, keep your mind on your job, and if you start to hear sounds from above, try to ignore them." What kind of sounds? The kind that don't belong in our world. July 9th, 1962, began like any other day in hell. The sun rose over Johnston Atoll at 0630 hours, turning the sky the colour of dried blood and casting long shadows across the concrete runways. I'd been awake since 0400, running final calibrations on the telemetry equipment and trying to ignore the knot of anxiety that had taken up permanent residence in my stomach. The detonation was scheduled for 0900 hours local time. At 0800, all personnel were ordered to their assigned positions. I was stationed in the main telemetry bunker, a reinforced concrete structure built into the side of a small hill on the northern end of the island. The bunker had no windows, and the only light came from the green glow of radar screens and the occasional flicker of indicator lights on the various instruments. Dr. Hawthorne was there, along with Bobby Chen and 2 other technicians I didn't know well. Everyone was wearing the standard issue radiation detection badges, but I noticed that Dr. Hawthorne had an additional device clipped to his belt, something that looked like a Geiger counter but with additional dials and meters I didn't recognise. "All right, gentlemen," Dr. Hawthorne said, his voice unnaturally calm. "T-minus 10 minutes. Remember your training. Watch your instruments. Record everything. And whatever happens, do not look up." At T-minus 5 minutes, a voice crackled over the radio. "Glass curtain control to all stations. Starfish Prime is go for detonation. All personnel confirm sealed status. Telemetry Station Alpha sealed and ready. Photography Station Bravo sealed and ready. Atmospheric Monitoring Station Charlie sealed and ready." The confirmations continued around the island. I focused on my instruments, watching the steady sweep of the radar display and the gentle fluctuations of the atmospheric pressure sensors. Everything was normal. Everything was quiet. T-minus 60 seconds, T-minus 30 seconds, T-minus 10 seconds. The countdown continued in my head. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. At exactly 900 hours, the world changed. Even through the concrete walls of the bunker, even with my eyes fixed firmly on the instruments in front of me, I saw the flash. It was like someone had turned on a searchlight inside my skull, a brilliant white light that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The dosimeter on my belt began clicking rapidly, then started emitting a steady whine that made my teeth ache. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that for just a moment, maybe 3 or 4 seconds, I forgot where I was. I forgot that I was in a bunker on a remote island in the Pacific. I forgot that I was David Rourke, radar technician, US Air Force. For those few seconds, I was floating in space, looking down at the Earth from an impossible height, and I could see. Jesus Christ, Bobby Chen whispered. Look at the radar. I shook my head, trying to clear the strange vision, and focused on the radar display. What I saw made no sense. Instead of the normal sweep showing the curvature of the Earth and the occasional aircraft, the screen showed a pattern I'd never seen before. A series of concentric circles expanding outward from a point directly above us, like ripples in a pond. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was that the ripples seemed to be bouncing back from something. As if there was a ceiling above us, something solid that the shockwave from the detonation had struck. "Are you getting this?" Dr. Hawthorne asked, his voice tight with excitement and fear. "Yes, sir, but I don't understand what I'm seeing." "None of us do. Keep recording." The radio crackled to life. "All stations, this is Glass Curtain Control. We have confirmation of successful detonation at 250 miles altitude. Initial radiation readings are within expected parameters. Atmospheric disturbance is significant." Significant was an understatement. The instruments were going crazy. Magnetic field measurements were fluctuating wildly, bouncing between readings that shouldn't have been possible. The atmospheric pressure sensors were showing variations that suggested the air itself was vibrating, and the radio communications were completely disrupted. We could barely hear Glass Curtain Control through the static. But the most disturbing thing was the sound. It started about 5 minutes after the detonation, a low-frequency hum that seemed to come from the sky itself. It was barely audible at first, more felt than heard, like standing next to a massive generator, but it grew stronger, deeper, until it seemed to vibrate in my bones. "Do you hear that?" I asked. Dr. Hawthorne nodded grimly. "We heard it during the test runs too. It usually stops after about an hour." "What causes it?" "We're not sure, but we have theories." The hum continued for exactly 57 minutes, then stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The sudden silence was almost worse than the sound itself. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Over the next few hours, reports began coming in from across the Pacific. Radio communications were disrupted as far away as Australia. Satellites were knocked offline, and strangest of all, aurora-like lights were seen in the sky as far south as Samoa, thousands of miles from where such phenomena should have been visible. But the really strange reports came from the civilian aircraft that happened to be in the area. 3 different pilots reported seeing what they described as a crack in the sky, a dark line that appeared to stretch from horizon to horizon, visible for several minutes before gradually fading away. When I asked Dr. Hawthorne about these reports, he just shook his head. "Optical illusions," he said. "The electromagnetic pulse from the detonation can cause temporary vision disturbances. Nothing more." But I could tell he didn't believe his own explanation. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that strange vision from the moment of detonation, floating in space, looking down at the Earth, seeing something that shouldn't have been there. I kept trying to remember what I'd seen, but the memory was like trying to hold water in my hands. The harder I tried to grasp it, the more it slipped away. Around 0300 hours, I gave up on sleep and decided to take a walk around the island. The night was clear, and for the first time since arriving at Johnston Atoll, I looked up at the sky. What I saw made my blood run cold. The stars were wrong. I'd been interested in astronomy since I was a kid, and I knew the constellations of the Northern Hemisphere like the back of my hand, but the stars I was looking at weren't arranged the way they should have been. Orion was tilted at an odd angle. The Big Dipper was distorted, as if someone had stretched it out of shape, and there were stars that shouldn't have been there at all, bright points of light in parts of the sky that should have been empty. I stood there for maybe 20 minutes trying to convince myself that I was seeing things, that the stress of the day had affected my perception, but the more I looked, the more certain I became that something was fundamentally wrong with the sky above Johnston Atoll. That's when I noticed the photographer. Marcus Webb was standing about 50 yards away, setting up a large camera on a tripod and pointing it straight up at the sky. He was wearing a pair of heavily tinted glasses and moving with the careful precision of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. I walked over to him. "Working late?" He jumped, startled. "Jesus, Dave, you scared me." "Sorry, couldn't sleep either?" "Yeah, something like that." He gestured at the camera. "Dr. Hawthorne asked me to take some night sky photographs. Routine atmospheric monitoring stuff." "At 3 in the morning?" "Best time for it. Less atmospheric disturbance." I looked at the camera more closely. It wasn't a standard military camera. It was something I'd never seen before, with additional lenses and filters that seemed to be designed for capturing very specific types of light. "Mind if I ask what you're looking for?" Marcus hesitated. "Officially?" "Aurora activity. Residual electromagnetic effects from the detonation." "And unofficially?" He glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. "Unofficially, we're looking for cracks." "Cracks in what?" "In whatever we hit up there." The next few days on Johnston Atoll were unlike anything I'd experienced in my military career. The detonation of Starfish Prime had created effects that nobody had anticipated, and the island buzzed with activity as scientists and technicians tried to make sense of what they were seeing. The most obvious effect was the continued disruption of radio communications. Even a week after the detonation, long-range radio was unreliable, with signals bouncing off something in the upper atmosphere that shouldn't have been there. Ships reported navigation problems, and several aircraft had to make emergency landings when their electronic systems failed unexpectedly. But the radio problems were just the beginning. On July 12th, 3 days after the detonation, the first reports of dead birds started coming in. They were found floating in the lagoon around Johnston Atoll, dozens of them, with no apparent cause of death. The base veterinarian who examined them found no signs of disease or injury. They had simply died in mid-flight, falling from the sky like stones. "Probably just confused by the electromagnetic pulse," Dr. Hawthorne explained when I asked him about it. "Birds use magnetic fields for navigation. The detonation disrupted their natural compass." But I'd seen confused birds before, and this wasn't the same thing. These birds had died suddenly and simultaneously, as if something had simply switched them off. The next day brought an even stranger report. A Navy patrol vessel stationed 50 miles south of Johnston Atoll reported that their radar was picking up a solid object approximately 200 miles above the Earth's surface. The object appeared to be stationary and roughly circular, with a diameter of several hundred miles. "Atmospheric anomaly," Dr. Hawthorne said when I asked him about it. "The detonation created a layer of ionized particles that's reflecting radar signals. It'll dissipate in a few days." But it didn't dissipate. If anything, it became more pronounced. By July 15th, radar installations as far away as Hawaii were reporting the same phenomenon. A solid, circular object suspended in the sky above the central Pacific, clearly visible on radar but invisible to the naked eye. That's when things started getting really strange. On the morning of July 16th, I was running routine calibrations on the telemetry equipment when I noticed something odd about the radar display. The normal sweep that showed the curvature of the Earth and the occasional aircraft was showing something else, a pattern of straight lines that seemed to form a geometric shape. I adjusted the settings, thinking it might be interference from the ionized particles in the upper atmosphere, but the pattern remained. It was clearly artificial, a series of interconnected lines that formed what looked like a hexagonal grid. "Hey Bobby," I called to Chen, who was working on the radio equipment nearby, "come take a look at this." He walked over and stared at the radar display. "What the hell is that?" "I was hoping you could tell me." We stood there for several minutes watching the geometric pattern pulse and shift on the screen. It was beautiful in a way, like a piece of abstract art rendered in electronic green. But it was also deeply unsettling, because it suggested that there was something up there, something structured and artificial, that was interacting with our radar signals. "Should we report this?" Bobby asked. Before I could answer, Dr. Hawthorne appeared behind us. "Report what?" I gestured at the radar display. "This pattern. It's been showing up for the past 20 minutes. Dr. Hawthorne looked at the screen and I saw his face go pale. "Turn it off." "Sir, turn off the radar. Now." I hesitated. "Is there a problem with the equipment?" There's a problem with what you're seeing. Turn it off." I switched off the radar, and the geometric pattern disappeared. Dr. Hawthorne stood there for a moment, staring at the blank screen, then turned to us with the expression of a man who was carrying a weight too heavy for his shoulders. "Gentlemen, I need to know that I can trust you. What you just saw is classified at the highest level. You will not discuss it with anyone, you will not include it in your reports, and you will not think about it too hard. Are we clear?" "Yes, sir," Bobby said immediately. "Sir," I said, "with respect, what exactly did we just see?" Dr. Hawthorne was quiet for a long moment. "Something that shouldn't exist. Something that's been there all along, but we only learned how to see it when we hit it hard enough." That night, I couldn't get the image of that hexagonal pattern out of my head. It reminded me of something, but I couldn't put my finger on what. I lay in my bunk, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of what was happening on Johnston Atoll. We were supposed to be testing the effects of high-altitude nuclear detonations on radio communications and satellite systems. But the more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that wasn't the real purpose of Operation Fishbowl. The equipment was wrong, the personnel were wrong, and the reactions of the scientists and officers suggested that they were looking for something specific, something they'd found. Around 200 hours, I decided I needed to see that restricted hangar. I slipped out of my bunk and made my way across the island, staying in the shadows and avoiding the patrol routes I'd memorised over the past week. The hangar was located on the southern end of the island, surrounded by a double fence and guarded by sentries who looked like they meant business. But I'd been sneaking around military installations since I was a private, and I knew how to avoid detection. I made my way to the back of the hangar, where a drainage ditch ran close to the outer fence. The ditch was filled with stagnant water and smelled like a latrine, but it provided cover. I crawled through the ditch until I reached a point where I could see through a gap in the inner fence. The hangar had a small window near the rear entrance, and through it I could see the interior. What I saw made me forget all about the smell of the ditch. The hangar was filled with photographic equipment, not the standard military cameras I was familiar with, but massive devices that looked more like scientific instruments than photography equipment. There were telescopes pointed at the ceiling, spectrometers, and devices I couldn't identify. But the most striking thing was the walls. Every wall of the hangar was covered with photographs, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They were arranged in a precise grid pattern, and each one showed the same thing: the sky above Johnston Atoll, but not the sky as it appeared to the naked eye. These photographs showed structure, geometric patterns, lines of force, and what looked like a vast hexagonal grid suspended in the upper atmosphere. And in several of the photographs I could see cracks. They were thin, dark lines that seemed to cut through the geometric pattern like fractures in glass. In some of the photos the cracks were barely visible. In others, they were wide enough that I could see darkness beyond them. Not the darkness of space, but something else, something that didn't belong in our world. I was so focused on the photographs that I almost didn't notice the label on one of the filing cabinets. Firmament reaction, event prism 6. Firmament, there was that word again. The barrier that separated the waters above from the waters below. The ceiling of the world. I was about to move closer to the window when I heard footsteps. I pressed myself flat against the bottom of the ditch and held my breath as two guards walked past, their boots crunching on the gravel path that ran around the perimeter of the hangar. "Still can't believe what we're seeing in those photos," one of them was saying. "Believe it," the other replied. "I've been here since the first test in April. Every time we hit it, it gets a little weaker, and every time it gets weaker, we see a little more of what's on the other side." "What do you think is on the other side?" "I don't know. And I don't want to know, but I'll tell you this much. It's been watching us for a long time, and now that we've cracked the shell, it's starting to watch us more closely." The footsteps faded as the guards continued their patrol. I waited another 10 minutes, then carefully made my way back to my quarters, but I didn't sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen in that hangar, and what the guards had said. We weren't just testing nuclear weapons, we were attacking something that had been protecting us, or containing us, or maybe both. And with each test we were making it weaker. The question was, what would happen when it finally broke? The answer to that question came sooner than I expected. On July 18th, 9 days after the Starfish Prime detonation, I was awakened at 0430 hours by the sound of sirens. Not the regular alert sirens that we'd grown accustomed to, but something different. A wailing, discordant sound that seemed to come from every direction at once. I threw on my uniform and ran outside, expecting to see some kind of emergency. A fire, perhaps, or a radiation leak. Instead, I found the entire base personnel standing in the main compound, all looking up at the sky with expressions of confusion and fear. The aurora was back. But this wasn't like the aurora that had been reported after the Starfish Prime detonation. This was something else entirely. The sky above Johnston Atoll was alive with colours that shouldn't have existed. Deep purples and electric greens that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. And within the aurora I could see patterns, geometric shapes that shifted and moved like living things. Beautiful, isn't it? Dr. Hawthorne appeared beside me, but his voice was tight with anxiety. What's causing it? Secondary effects from the detonation. The electromagnetic pulse disrupted the magnetic field lines in the upper atmosphere. This is just the energy finding its way back to equilibrium. But even as he said it, I could tell he didn't believe his own explanation. The aurora was too organised, too purposeful. It looked less like a natural phenomenon and more like communication. "Dr. Hawthorne," I said carefully, "well, what exactly are we doing here?" He was quiet for a long moment, watching the lights dance across the sky. "We're explorers, Mr. Rourke. We're trying to understand the nature of the world we live in. Sometimes that means pushing boundaries that perhaps shouldn't be pushed. And if we push too hard, then we find out what's on the other side." The aurora lasted for 3 hours, then faded as suddenly as it had appeared. But the effect lingered. Throughout the day, personnel reported strange sensations, a feeling of being watched, unexplained sounds, and brief glimpses of movement in their peripheral vision. The most disturbing report came from Dr. Kellerman, the physicist who'd been part of the Manhattan Project. He claimed that he'd seen figures in the aurora, humanoid shapes that seemed to be observing the island from above. "Probably just pareidolia," Dr. Hawthorne said when I asked him about it. "The tendency to see patterns where none exist. Stress can cause hallucinations." But I'd seen the way Dr. Kellerman looked at the sky that morning, and it wasn't the look of a man who was hallucinating. It was the look of a man who'd seen something that challenged everything he thought he knew about reality. That afternoon I was in the telemetry station when Bobby Chen burst through the door, his face white with excitement and fear. "Dave, you need to see this. Now." He led me to the communications room where he'd been monitoring radio transmissions from around the Pacific. The radio was crackling with static, but through the interference I could hear something else, a rhythmic pattern that sounded almost like music. "It started about an hour ago," Bobby said. "It's coming from directly above us. Same frequency as our standard communications, but the signal is stronger than anything we've ever detected." I listened to the pattern for several minutes. It was hauntingly beautiful, but there was something unsettling about it, a quality that made my skin crawl and my teeth ache. "Have you reported this to Dr. Hawthorne?" I tried. He told me to stop monitoring that frequency and focus on standard communications protocols. "But you didn't stop." "No, I didn't. And Dave, I think there's something else. I think there's a message in the signal, a pattern that's too complex to be natural." We spent the next hour trying to decode the signal, but it was beyond our capabilities. The pattern was intricate and layered, with harmonics and overtones that suggested a level of sophistication that shouldn't have been possible. "Bobby," I said finally, "I need to tell you something. Something I saw in that restricted hangar." I told him about the photographs, the geometric patterns, and the cracks in what the files had labelled as the firmament. I told him about the conversation I'd overheard between the guards, and about the growing certainty that Operation Fishbowl wasn't really about testing nuclear weapons at all. "So what do you think we're really doing here?" he asked. "I think we're trying to break through something that's been protecting us, or containing us, or both, and I think we're succeeding." That night I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to document what was happening on Johnstone Atoll regardless of the consequences. I found an old camera in the equipment storage room and began taking photographs of everything I could. The strange readings on the telemetry equipment, the geometric patterns on the radar displays, and most importantly, the sky itself. What I saw through the camera lens was nothing like what I saw with the naked eye. The sky above Johnstone Atoll was full of structure. Through the camera I could see the hexagonal grid that had shown up on the radar, but in much greater detail. It was vast, stretching from horizon to horizon, and it was clearly artificial. The geometric patterns were too precise, too regular to be natural. And there were cracks. Thin, dark lines that cut through the geometric pattern like fractures in glass. In some areas the cracks were barely visible. In others, they were wide enough that I could see through them to something else. Something that didn't belong in our world. I took dozens of photographs, using different filters and exposure settings to capture as much detail as possible. Some of the images showed the geometric patterns clearly. Others showed the cracks, and a few, the ones that would haunt my dreams for the rest of my life, showed what was on the other side. It was dark, but not the darkness of space. This was something else, a darkness that seemed to have depth and substance, as if it were alive. And within that darkness I could see shapes, geometric forms that defied description, moving with purpose and intelligence. But the most disturbing thing was that they seemed to be looking back. On July 20th, Dr. Hawthorne called me into his office for what he described as a routine progress review. But the moment I walked through the door, I knew this wasn't routine. There were two men in civilian clothes sitting beside his desk, men with the cold, professional demeanour of intelligence officers. "Mr. Rourke," Dr. Hawthorne said, "these gentlemen are from Washington. They have some questions about your work here." The older of the two men introduced himself as Mr. Smith, obviously not his real name. He was tall and thin, with grey hair and eyes like chips of ice. The younger man, who called himself Mr. Jones, remained silent throughout the entire interview. "We understand you've been taking an unusual interest in your work here," Mr. Smith said, "above and beyond your assigned duties." "I'm just trying to do my job, sir." "Your job is telemetry calibration. Nothing more, nothing less." He opened a folder and pulled out several photographs. My photographs. "These were found in your quarters during a routine security inspection." My blood ran cold. "I can explain those." "I'm sure you can. But I don't think you understand the seriousness of what you've been doing. These images show classified information that could compromise national security if they fell into the wrong hands." "What exactly am I looking at in these photographs?" Mr. Smith studied me for a long moment. "You're looking at the ceiling of the world, Mr. Rourke, and thanks to our work here, you're also looking at the cracks we've put in it." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Do you know what the firmament is, Mr. Rourke? The Bible mentions it. Some kind of barrier between the waters above and the waters below." "Exactly. And for thousands of years it's kept us safe, kept us contained, kept us from seeing what's really out there." He gestured at the photographs. "But we've changed that. With each detonation, we've weakened the barrier, and with each crack we've opened a window into something that was never meant to be seen." "What's on the other side?" "Intelligence, purpose, intent. Things that have been watching us for longer than our species has existed, and now that we've cracked their cage, they're starting to take a more active interest in our world." Mr. Smith stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Pacific Ocean. "There's going to be another test, Mr. Rourke, tomorrow night. But this one is different. This one is designed to focus all of our energy on a single point in the barrier. If our calculations are correct, it should create a breach large enough for direct communication." "Communication with what?" "With whatever is up there. And when that happens, your job will be to document everything. Every signal, every image, every anomaly. Because what we learn from this test will determine the future of human civilization." I left Dr. Hawthorne's office with my head spinning. Everything I thought I knew about Operation Fishbowl had been wrong. We weren't testing weapons. We weren't studying atmospheric effects. We were deliberately trying to break through a barrier that had protected humanity for millennia. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the photographs, about the geometric patterns in the sky, and about the shapes I'd seen moving in the darkness beyond the cracks. Whatever was up there, it was intelligent, and it was watching us. Around 0300 hours, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze, the low-frequency hum that had followed the Starfish Prime detonation. But this time, it was different. This time, it sounded almost like voices. I got up and walked to the window of my quarters. The sky was clear, filled with stars that still seemed to be in the wrong positions. But as I watched, the stars began to move. Not the slow movement of celestial bodies, but rapid, purposeful motion, as if they were arranging themselves into patterns. Within minutes, the stars had formed a perfect hexagonal grid across the entire sky. And in the centre of the grid, a dark circle appeared, a hole in the stars that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. That's when I saw them. Shapes began to emerge from the dark circle, geometric forms that defied description, moving with purpose and intelligence. They were beautiful in a way that hurt to look at, like living mathematics, like crystallized music. And as they moved across the sky, I could hear their voices, not sound exactly, but something that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to my mind. They were saying something important, but I couldn't understand the words. The vision lasted for maybe 10 minutes, then faded as suddenly as it had appeared. The stars returned to their normal positions and the sky became ordinary again, but I knew that what I'd seen was real. The barrier was weakening, and whatever was on the other side was trying to communicate with us. The second test was scheduled for 2100 hours on July 21st. This time, the warhead was different, designed not to explode in a traditional sense, but to focus all of its energy upward in a concentrated beam. Dr. Hawthorne called it a drill-tip warhead, a device specifically engineered to punch through the firmament rather than simply damage it. I spent the day preparing the telemetry equipment, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept thinking about the vision from the night before, about the geometric shapes moving across the sky, and about the voices that had spoken directly to my mind. Whatever was up there, it knew we were coming, and it was ready for us. At 1800 hours, I was in the telemetry bunker making final preparations when Marcus Webb appeared in the doorway. He looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes, and the kind of nervous energy that comes from too much coffee and too little sleep. "Dave," he said, "I need to show you something." He led me to a small storage room behind the main bunker, where he'd set up a makeshift darkroom. The room was filled with photographic equipment and dozens of developed photographs pinned to the walls. "I've been developing the plates from the night sky photography," he said, "and I've found something that, well, you need to see it." He handed me a photograph that showed the sky above Johnston Atoll, but not as it appeared to the naked eye. The image revealed the hexagonal grid in stunning detail, but what caught my attention were the cracks, dozens of them spreading across the geometric pattern like a spider web. When was this taken? 3 days ago. But look at this one. He handed me another photograph taken the previous night. The cracks were larger, more numerous, and in several places I could see through them to the darkness beyond. "It's getting worse," Marcus said. "Every day the cracks spread a little further, and Dave, I think I know why." He pulled out a folder marked Classified Eyes Only and opened it to reveal a series of technical drawings. They showed the drill-tip warhead in detail, but what struck me was the precision of the design. This wasn't a weapon designed to destroy, it was a tool designed to open. "They're not trying to break the firmament," Marcus said. "They're trying to open a door." Before I could respond, the lights in the storage room flickered and went out. We were plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the red glow of the darkroom safe light. And in that red light I saw something that made my heart stop. The photographs on the walls were changing. The images that had shown static geometric patterns and cracks were now showing movement. The shapes beyond the cracks were shifting, growing larger, as if they were approaching the barrier from the other side. "Do you see that?" I whispered. Marcus nodded, his face pale in the red light. "They know we're here. They know what we're planning." The lights came back on and the photographs returned to normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not just by the things beyond the firmament, but by the firmament itself. At 20:30 hours, all personnel were ordered to their assigned positions for the second test. I was back in the telemetry bunker with Dr. Hawthorne, Bobby Chen and Dr. Kellerman. The atmosphere was tense, electric with anticipation and fear. "Gentlemen," Dr. Hawthorne said, "tonight we make history. Tonight we open a door that has been closed since the beginning of time. Whatever happens, whatever you see or hear, remember that you are witnessing the next stage of human evolution." At 20:50 hours, the countdown began. But this time, something was different. The instruments were picking up activity in the upper atmosphere, electromagnetic fluctuations that suggested something was already happening up there. "Are you getting this?" Dr. Kellerman asked, staring at his instruments in disbelief. "Getting what? There's something up there. Something big. It's like the entire firmament is vibrating." I looked at my own instruments and saw what he meant. The readings were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Patterns that suggested the geometric structure in the sky was resonating, like a vast musical instrument being played by unseen hands. T-minus 60 seconds. The vibrations grew stronger. The bunker itself began to shake, as if the entire island was responding to whatever was happening in the sky above us. T-minus 30 seconds. A sound began to build, not the low-frequency hum we'd heard before, but something else. Something that sounded almost like singing. Harmonies that were beautiful and terrible at the same time. Voices that spoke in mathematics and music. T-minus 10 seconds. The singing grew louder, more complex, and through the concrete walls of the bunker, I began to see light. Not the harsh white light of a nuclear detonation, but something softer, more organic. Light that pulsed with the rhythm of the singing. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The drill tip warhead detonated at exactly 2100 hours, 250 miles above Johnston Atoll. But instead of the brilliant flash we'd experienced with Starfish Prime, this detonation was different. The light built slowly, like a sunrise in reverse, growing brighter and more intense until it seemed to fill the entire sky. And then I saw it. Through the concrete walls, through the roof of the bunker, I could see the firmament itself. Not as a barrier or a ceiling, but as a living thing, a vast geometric organism that pulsed with its own inner light. And in the centre of it, where the drill-tip warhead had struck, there was a hole. Not a crack this time, but an opening. A doorway. And something was coming through. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time. A being of pure geometry and light that moved with purpose and intelligence. As it descended toward the earth, I could hear its voice in my mind, speaking in concepts that human language couldn't express. But one message came through clearly. We have been waiting. The being hovered above Johnston Atoll for exactly 17 seconds, during which time every instrument on the island went haywire. Magnetic fields fluctuated wildly, radiation levels spiked, and the very air seemed to vibrate with alien energy. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the being withdrew. The hole in the firmament closed, the light faded, and the singing stopped. We were alone again, but the silence felt different now. It felt like the silence of a world that had been fundamentally changed. In the days that followed, the official reports described the test as a partial success with unexpected complications. The radiation levels were within acceptable parameters, they said. The electromagnetic effects were consistent with previous high-altitude detonations. There were no anomalous readings, no unusual phenomena, no contact with any external intelligence. But I knew better. We all knew better. Dr. Kellerman was the first to crack. 3 days after the second test, he was found in his quarters, writing frantically in his logbook. The same phrase, over and over again. There's something on the other side. There's something on the other side. There's something on the other side. He was sedated and removed from the island within hours. Marcus Webb was next. He became obsessed with his photographs, spending hours in the darkroom developing and redeveloping the same images, convinced that he could see faces in the geometric patterns. He claimed that the beings beyond the firmament were trying to communicate through the photographic plates, sending messages in the arrangement of light and shadow. He disappeared one night, along with all of his photographs and equipment. The official report said he'd suffered a nervous breakdown and had been transferred to a psychiatric facility on the mainland, but I knew better. I'd seen the men in civilian clothes who'd come for him, the same men who'd questioned me in Dr. Hawthorne's office. Bobby Chen lasted longer than the others, but the stress eventually got to him too. He started hearing voices in the radio static, not the beautiful singing we'd heard during the second test, but something else, something that sounded like screaming. One morning I found him in the communications room, frantically adjusting the radio dials and muttering to himself. "They're angry," he kept saying. "We broke their house, and now they're angry." He was gone by afternoon. That left me alone with Dr. Hawthorne and a handful of other personnel who either hadn't seen what we'd seen or were better at pretending it hadn't happened. But I could tell that Dr. Hawthorne was struggling too. He'd lost weight, his hands shook when he thought no one was looking, and I sometimes caught him staring at the sky with the expression of a man who'd seen too much. On August 15th, exactly 1 month after the second test, Dr. Hawthorne called me into his office for what I assumed would be another security briefing. Instead, I found him pacing behind his desk, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table beside him. "Sit down, Rourke," he said without looking at me. "We need to talk." I sat down and waited. Dr. Hawthorne continued pacing for several minutes before finally stopping at the window that looked out over the Pacific. "Do you know what we've done?" he asked finally. "Sir, do you understand what we've accomplished here? What we've unleashed?" I decided to be honest. "I think we've opened a door that should have stayed closed." He laughed, but there was no humour in it. "A door. Yes, that's one way to put it. We've opened a door into a realm that exists parallel to our own. A realm inhabited by beings of pure mathematics and energy. Beings that have been watching us since the dawn of time. What do they want? I don't know. But I know they're not pleased with what we've done. The firmament wasn't just a barrier, Rourke. It was a protection. A cage that kept us safe from things we were never meant to encounter." He turned away from the window and looked at me directly. "There's going to be a third test, October 12th, and this one is going to tear the firmament wide open, permanently. Can't you stop it?" "Stop it?" He laughed again, and this time the sound was tinged with hysteria. "Rourke, I'm not in charge here. I never was. The men who give the orders, the men who designed this program, they know exactly what they're doing. They want to break through the firmament. They want to make contact with whatever is on the other side. Why? Because they think they can control it. They think they can harness the power of beings that exist outside our reality and use it for their own purposes. They don't understand that some doors, once opened, can never be closed." That night I made my decision. I was going to escape from Johnston Atoll with evidence of what had happened there, and I was going to tell the world the truth about Operation Fishbowl. I spent the next week preparing. I gathered copies of the most important documents, including the technical specifications for the drill-tip warhead and the preliminary reports from the first 2 tests. I also managed to steal one of Marcus Webb's undeveloped photographic plates, the one that showed the hole in the firmament most clearly. My plan was simple: wait for the monthly supply flight, hide in the cargo hold, and hope I could make it to Hawaii before anyone noticed I was missing. But on the night before the supply flight was scheduled to arrive, they came for me. I was awakened by the sound of footsteps outside my quarters, not the regular footsteps of the night patrol, but the measured tread of men who knew exactly where they were going. I had just enough time to hide the photographic plate in my sock before the door burst open. Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 armed guards. Mr. Smith was holding a syringe filled with a clear liquid. "Time for debriefing, Mr. Rourke," he said calmly. I tried to run, but the guards were faster. They held me down while Mr. Smith administered the injection. The drug took effect almost immediately, a warm, drowsy feeling that made it difficult to think clearly. "Don't worry," Mr. Smith said as my vision began to blur. "This won't hurt. You'll just forget a few things, unimportant things, classified things." But the drug didn't work as well as they'd hoped. Maybe it was adrenaline, maybe it was sheer determination, but I managed to retain most of my memories. The details were fuzzy, but the important things remained clear. The geometric patterns in the sky, the cracks in the firmament, and the beings that lived beyond the barrier. I was transferred off Johnston Atoll the next morning, officially discharged from the Air Force due to psychological stress related to extended deployment in a hostile environment. My security clearance was revoked, my service records were classified, and I was given a stern warning about the consequences of discussing my experiences with unauthorized personnel. They thought they had silenced me. They were wrong. I spent the next 25 years trying to piece together what had happened on Johnston Atoll and what it meant for humanity. I researched Operation Fishbowl, studied the official reports, and tried to find other personnel who had been stationed there during the summer of 1962. Most of them were dead, suicides, accidents, and mysterious illnesses that the government attributed to delayed radiation exposure. The few survivors I managed to locate had either been subjected to the same memory suppression drugs I'd received, or were so traumatized by their experiences that they refused to talk about them. But I found enough evidence to confirm what I already knew. Operation Fishbowl was never about testing nuclear weapons. It was about breaking through the firmament and making contact with the intelligences that lived beyond it. The third test took place as scheduled on October 12, 1962, just days before the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. According to the official reports, it was another partial success. But I know better. I know that the third test succeeded in creating a permanent breach in the firmament, a doorway that has remained open ever since. The evidence is all around us if you know how to look for it. The increase in UFO sightings since 1962, the strange geometric patterns that occasionally appear in the sky, the growing number of people who report seeing things that shouldn't exist, hearing voices that speak in mathematics and music. They're still up there, beyond the firmament, watching us through the cracks we created, and they're not happy about what we've done. I've hidden this manuscript in a place where it will be found eventually, along with the single photographic plate I managed to save from Johnston Atoll. The plate shows the firmament as it truly is, not a barrier, but a living organism, and in the centre of the image, clearly visible, is the hole we punched through it with our drill-tip warhead. Behind that hole is darkness, and in that darkness, shapes that defy description, shapes that are watching us, waiting for the right moment to come through. The government knows the truth, of course. They've known it since 1962, but they've decided that the knowledge is too dangerous for the general public. They've classified the evidence, silenced the witnesses, and maintained the fiction that Operation Fishbowl was nothing more than a routine nuclear test program. But the truth has a way of surfacing eventually, and when it does, when the world finally learns what we did up there in the summer of 1962, I hope it's not too late to close the door we opened. They told us it was just a test, but what they were really testing was the ceiling. And now that we've cracked it, something else is looking down at us from above, something that was never meant to share our world. God help us all. The summer of 1998 was suffocating in suburban Ohio. 10-year-old Silas Greer lay in his bed, sheets kicked off, staring at the ceiling fan that barely moved the thick air. Sleep was a stranger to him then, had been since he was 7. While other kids his age were dreaming of baseball and bicycles, Silas was discovering the strange world that existed after midnight. When the normal rules seemed suspended and the impossible felt possible, that's how he found Coast to Coast AM. Art Bell's voice was like a beacon in the darkness, smooth and knowing, speaking to the insomniacs and the curious, the believers and the skeptics. Silas had discovered the show 3 months earlier, accidentally, when his father's radio had been left on after a late-night fishing report. Now it was ritual. Every night he'd tune in on his small transistor radio, volume low enough that his parents wouldn't hear, but clear enough that Bell's voice could carry him through the endless dark hours. July 29th, 1998. A Wednesday night, that would change everything. Bell was in his element that evening, fielding calls about UFO sightings in Nevada, discussing the latest conspiracy theories about Area 51. Silas had heard it all before. The show had its regular callers, its familiar rhythms. But then Bell's voice took on a different quality, more serious, more intrigued. "Folks, I've just received a fax that's, well, it's something else entirely. This comes from someone calling himself John Titor, and he claims to be writing from the year 2036. Silas sat up in bed, suddenly alert. Time travel stories were common on Coast to Coast, but there was something in Bell's tone that suggested this was different. "Now, I've read a lot of these over the years," Bell continued, "but this one is remarkably detailed, remarkably specific. Let me read it to you." The fax was unlike anything Silas had ever heard. This John Titor person spoke with clinical precision about future events. A civil war that would tear the United States apart by 2005, a mission to retrieve an IBM 5100 computer from 1975, something called the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. But what struck Silas most was the voice behind the words. Even filtered through Bell's reading, there was something desperate about it, something urgent. "I am a time traveller from the year 2036, Bell read. "I'm on my way home after getting an IBM 5100 computer system from the year 1975. My time machine is a stationary mass temporal displacement unit powered by two top-spin dual positive singularities that produce a standard offset Tipler sinusoid." The technical jargon washed over Silas, but he grabbed his notebook, the one he kept for recording interesting things he heard on the show, and began sketching. He drew timelines, tried to capture the dates Titor mentioned, the strange sense of inevitability in his words. "The Civil War in America will start in 2005, Bell continued reading. "By 2015, Russia will launch a nuclear strike against the major cities in the United States, China and Europe. The US cities are destroyed along with the AFE American Federal Empire. The European Union and China will also be destroyed. Oddly enough, Russia is not a target." Silas's pencil moved frantically across the page. Something about this felt different from the usual coast-to-coast fare. This wasn't someone looking for attention or trying to sell a book. This felt like a warning, like a message in a bottle thrown across an ocean of time. But then something strange happened. The broadcast began to experience interference, static that seemed to pulse with an almost organic rhythm. Through the white noise, Silas could swear he heard another voice, fainter than Bell's but distinct. It sounded like it was saying something, but the words were lost in the electronic snow. Bell paused in his reading. "We're having some technical difficulties here, folks. Bear with us." The static continued for nearly 30 seconds, and then cleared as suddenly as it had begun. Bell resumed reading, but Silas noticed something odd. The flow of the text seemed different now, as if something had been skipped over. "Well, that's quite a fax," Bell said when he finished. "John Titor from 2036. If you're listening, John, give us a call. I'd love to hear more about this time machine of yours." But no call came. The show moved on to other topics, other mysteries. Silas, however, remained fixated on what he had heard. He spent the rest of the night filling his notebook with questions, theories, timelines. There was something about the Titor facts that felt unfinished, as if the static had interrupted something important. Over the following weeks, Silas found himself returning to those notes again and again. He checked the official coast-to-coast archives, but the version posted online seemed shorter than what he remembered hearing. Some of the details felt missing, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what. The summer ended, school began, and life moved forward. But Silas never forgot that night, never forgot the urgency in those words read by Art Bell's familiar voice. He kept the notebook, even as he grew older, even as the memory began to feel more like a dream than a real experience. He had no way of knowing that 27 years later, he would discover that his childhood memory was more accurate than any official record, and that the missing pieces of that broadcast would lead him into a conspiracy that stretched across decades and possibly across time itself. 2025 arrived with the same quiet desperation that had marked the previous few years. Silas Greer, now 37, and bearing the weight of too many sleepless nights, worked in a building that didn't officially exist. Division Calder occupied 3 floors of a nondescript office complex in McLean, Virginia, hidden beneath the innocuous nameplate of the Federal Data Compliance Agency. His job title was Classified Systems Analyst, which meant he spent his days diving into the digital archaeology of government databases, tracking down corrupted files, fixing network vulnerabilities, and occasionally stumbling across information that reminded him why his security clearance came with a lifetime non-disclosure agreement. The work suited him. It was methodical, solitary, and allowed him to disappear into the intricate puzzles of data systems. Most importantly, it kept his mind occupied during the day, which made the sleepless nights marginally more bearable. On a Tuesday morning in March, Silas was conducting a routine audit of the division's network infrastructure when he noticed something unusual. A relay node in the deepest part of the system was showing signs of corruption. Not the usual degradation of old hardware, but something more deliberate. The corruption patterns were too regular, too purposeful. Following the digital breadcrumbs, Silas traced the compromised node to an offline vault he had never seen before. The access path was buried beneath layers of security protocols, and the vault itself was labelled with a designation that made his pulse quicken. Orpheus 99, Titor Incident, Division SP Delta. Titor. The name hit him like a physical blow, dragging him instantly back to that summer night in 1998, to Art Bell's voice reading impossible words from an impossible source. For 27 years that memory had lived in the back of his mind, a strange childhood fixation that he'd never quite been able to shake. His hands trembled slightly as he initiated the access protocols. His clearance level was sufficient, barely, but he had to route through several proxy servers to avoid triggering automatic monitoring systems. Whatever was in this vault, it was meant to stay buried. The files began to populate on his screen, and Silas felt his worldview tilt on its axis. Operation Echo Prism was the primary designation. The associated documents painted a picture that was both impossible and terrifyingly plausible. The files contained logs referencing Temporal Incursion 001, codename TITOR, along with directives marked Retroactive Suppression and Narrative Severance Protocol. But it was the audio file that stopped his heart. The file was labelled Coast to Coast AM 072998 uncut.wav and was significantly larger than any archived version of that broadcast should have been. Silas's hands shook as he downloaded it to a secure partition and opened it in an audio editing program. Art Bell's voice filled his headphones, exactly as he remembered it from that night 27 years ago. The familiar cadence, the careful reading of the Titor facts. But as the broadcast progressed, Silas began to notice discrepancies. The version he was hearing was longer, more detailed. The static that had interrupted the broadcast was there, but it was different, more structured, more purposeful. And then, as the static cleared, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Another voice, faint but distinct, speaking over the interference. Not Art Bell's voice, but something else entirely. The words were distorted, but with some audio manipulation, Silas was able to enhance them. "They found me. I never meant to be here. Don't trust the timeline. It's being rewritten." The voice was desperate, terrified, and it was definitely not part of the original broadcast. Silas sat back in his chair, staring at the waveform on his screen. This was impossible. The file was clearly authentic. The metadata showed it was recorded directly from the Coast to Coast AM broadcast feed. But this enhanced version contained material that had never been publicly archived. He spent the next several hours diving deeper into the ORPHEUS files. What he found painted a picture of a government operation that defied everything he thought he knew about reality. Project Locust Vale appeared to be some sort of information warfare initiative, designed to suppress or alter public perception of specific events. The Titor incident was listed as the final uncollapsed vector in a series of what the files called temporal anomalies. The document suggested that the John Titor who'd sent that fax to Art Bell was not a hoax, not a creative fiction, but something far more dangerous. A genuine disruption to the timeline that had required immediate containment. According to the files, the original broadcast had been intercepted and edited in real time. The version that was archived and distributed publicly had been carefully sanitized, with the most alarming elements removed. The static that Silas remembered was actually the sound of the timeline being corrected, whatever that meant. But perhaps most disturbing of all was a series of voice print analyses comparing the mysterious second voice in the static to various archived recordings. The analysis showed a match to 3 encrypted internal calls, all made from phones within government facilities. One of those calls was time-stamped at 11:47 p.m. on July 29th, 1998, the same night as the original broadcast. Silas stared at the screen until his eyes burned. If these files were genuine, then everything he thought he knew about the Titor incident was wrong. The hoax wasn't John Titor's claims about time travel. The hoax was the cover-up, the carefully constructed narrative that had been designed to make the truth look like fiction. He made copies of everything, storing them on encrypted drives and hidden partitions. Something told him that his access to these files wouldn't last long. Whatever Division Calder was really doing, and whatever the truth about John Titor really was, powerful people had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep it buried. As he prepared to leave the office that evening, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The familiar paranoia of his profession had taken on a new intensity. He had always known that information was dangerous, but this was different. This felt like he had stumbled across a secret that could rewrite history itself. That night, for the first time in weeks, Silas didn't have trouble sleeping. But his dreams were filled with static, with voices calling across impossible distances, with the growing certainty that the past was not as fixed as he had always believed. The obsession consumed him. Over the following weeks, Silas found himself spending every free moment analysing the Orpheus files, comparing the uncut broadcast with public archives, and trying to piece together a timeline that made any kind of sense. He started with the basics. The original Coast to Coast AM broadcast from July 29th, 1998, was publicly available in multiple archives, but when he compared these versions with the uncut file he'd discovered, the differences were subtle but unmistakable. Entire sections had been removed, not just edited, but completely excised from the historical record. The public version of the broadcast ran for exactly 47 minutes and 32 seconds. The uncut version was 51 minutes and 18 seconds long. Nearly 4 minutes of material had been removed, and the editing was so seamless that it was impossible to detect without a direct comparison. But it wasn't just the length that was different. The content itself had been altered. In the public version, Titor's message was presented as an interesting curiosity, a well-crafted piece of science fiction that Bell read with his usual mix of skepticism and entertainment. In the uncut version, Bell's tone was different, more serious, more concerned. There were moments where he paused, as if he was grappling with the implications of what he was reading. "Folks, I have to tell you," Bell said in the uncut version, "this is unlike anything I've ever received. The level of detail, the technical specifications, this doesn't read like someone's creative writing project. This reads like a field report." Those words didn't exist in any public archive. Silas began to dig deeper, tracking down early internet discussions of the Titor incident. He found references to the original broadcast in archived Usenet groups and early web forums, but many of the most detailed discussions had been removed or altered. It was as if someone had gone through the early internet with a fine-toothed comb, systematically removing or modifying any reference to the uncut version of the broadcast. The more he investigated, the more convinced he became that the Orpheus files represented a massive information warfare operation. Someone with significant resources and access had gone to extraordinary lengths to alter the historical record of the Titor incident. But why? What was so dangerous about John Titor's message that it required this level of suppression? The answer came when Silas began analysing the metadata embedded in the ORPHEUS files. Hidden within the digital fingerprints of the documents was a wealth of information about their origins and the people who had created them. The files had been compiled by something called the Temporal Anomaly Research Division, which appeared to be a joint operation between the NSA, the CIA, and a private contractor called Meridian Dynamics. The project had been running since 1947, originally focused on what the files called chronological inconsistencies, events that seemed to violate the normal flow of cause and effect. The Titor incident was classified as a Type 7 temporal anomaly, defined as direct communication from an alternate or future timeline. According to the files, the government had been tracking and suppressing temporal anomalies for decades. The Titor incident was significant because it was the first time such an anomaly had occurred in a public forum, broadcast live to millions of listeners across the country. The files contained detailed analysis of Titor's message, breaking down not just the content, but the linguistic patterns, the choice of words, even the rhythm of the sentences. The conclusion was unanimous among the analysts. This was not a hoax. The message showed signs of what they called temporal displacement syndrome, linguistic patterns that suggested the author was experiencing time in a non-linear fashion. But perhaps most disturbing was the section labelled Containment Protocols. The files outlined a comprehensive plan to discredit the Titor incident through a combination of disinformation and narrative manipulation. False information would be seeded into online forums, creating a confusing web of contradictory claims that would make it impossible for anyone to determine what was real and what was fabricated. The plan had worked perfectly. By 2001, when someone calling themselves John Titor began posting on internet forums, the narrative had been so thoroughly corrupted that the real message was lost in a sea of science fiction and hoax claims. Silas spent hours studying the forum posts attributed to John Titor, comparing them with the original facts that had been read on Coast to Coast AM. The differences were striking. The forum posts were elaborate, entertaining, and full of the kind of time travel technobabble that science fiction fans loved. The original facts was terse, technical, and terrifying in its implications. The forum posts were the disinformation campaign. They were designed to turn John Titor into a figure of fun, an internet legend that no one would take seriously. The real John Titor, the one who had sent that fax to Art Bell, had been erased from history. But who was he? And where had he come from? The answer to that question would lead Silas down a rabbit hole that would shake his understanding of reality itself. The first sign that Silas had attracted unwanted attention came on a Thursday morning in late March. He arrived at his desk to find that his security badge had been downgraded. Not revoked entirely, but his access to certain systems had been restricted. When he tried to access the Orpheus files, he was met with an error message he'd never seen before. Access denied, subject classification under review. His supervisor, a thin man named Carson, who rarely spoke and never smiled, appeared at his cubicle within minutes. Greer, there's been a security audit. Some irregularities in your access patterns. Nothing serious, but you'll need to stick to your assigned projects for the next few weeks while we sort it out. Silas nodded, keeping his expression neutral. Of course, whatever you need. But Carson's eyes lingered on him for a moment too long, and Silas got the distinct impression that this was not a routine security audit. Over the following days, the surveillance became more obvious. His computer would crash at exactly 2:11 a.m. every night, regardless of whether he was using it or not. The crashes were too regular, too precise to be coincidental. Someone was monitoring his system and shutting it down at predetermined intervals. His attempts to communicate with the outside world were also being interfered with. Emails to friends and family would bounce back as undeliverable. His phone calls would drop after exactly 3 minutes. Even his internet searches were being filtered. Certain keywords would return no results, while others would redirect him to innocuous websites. But it was the woman in the slate trench coat who confirmed his worst suspicions. She appeared on Monday morning, standing across the street from his office building. Tall, professional-looking with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. She stood in the same spot for exactly 15 minutes from 8:45 to 9 a.m, then disappeared. The next day she was back, same time, same position. By Friday, Silas had confirmed the pattern. The woman appeared every morning at 8:45 a.m. and every evening at 5:15 p.m. She never looked directly at the building, never made any obvious attempt to observe him, but her presence was too regular to be coincidental. On the following Monday, everything changed. When Silas arrived at his desk, he found a message on his computer terminal. Not an email, not a system notification, but a text file that had been placed directly on his desktop. The file name was simply readme.txt. The message inside was brief. Dr. Lenara Voss, former DoD temporal linguistics analyst, presumed dead in 2016. Titor wasn't a hoax. He wasn't first either. He was the last natural variable. Underground parking garage, level B3 tonight at 11 p.m. Come alone. Bring the files. Silas stared at the message for a long time. Dr. Lenara Voss was a name he recognised from the Orpheus files. She had been one of the lead analysts on the Titor project. According to the documents, she had died in a car accident in 2016, but her analysis of the temporal anomalies had been instrumental in developing the containment protocols. If she was alive, and if she was reaching out to him, then everything was about to change. The rest of the day passed in a blur of paranoia and anticipation. Silas went through the motions of his normal routine, but his mind was racing. He made copies of all the files he'd discovered, storing them on multiple encrypted drives. If this was a trap, he wanted to make sure the information would survive him. At 10:45 p.m, he made his way to the underground parking garage. Level B3 was normally deserted at this hour, lit by flickering fluorescent lights that cast long shadows between the concrete pillars. The place felt like a tomb sealed off from the world above. She was waiting for him near the elevator bank, but she looked nothing like the woman he had seen across the street. This Dr. Lenara Voss was in her 50s, with greying hair and the kind of exhausted look that came from too many years of carrying dangerous secrets. She wore a simple black jacket and jeans, and her eyes never stopped moving, constantly scanning the shadows for threats. "You found the Orpheus files," she said without preamble. "How much do you know?" "I know that the Titor incident was real," Silas replied. "I know that someone went to extraordinary lengths to cover it up, and I know that you're supposed to be dead." She smiled grimly. "Death is a relative concept in this business. I've been dead for 9 years, and it's been the safest 9 years of my life. Until now." "What do you mean?" "I mean that someone with access to the Orpheus files has been poking around, asking questions, making copies. That someone is you, and now they know about me too." Silas felt a chill run down his spine. "Who are they?" "The people who have been managing the timeline for the past 70 years. The people who decided that certain events needed to be erased from history. The people who made sure that John Titor became a joke instead of a warning." She gestured for him to follow her deeper into the garage, away from the elevator and the security cameras. When they reached a secluded corner, she turned to face him. "What I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible," she said. "But you've already seen the evidence. You know that the official story is a lie. The question is, are you ready to learn the truth?" Silas nodded, though he wasn't sure he was ready for anything. "John Titor was real," she continued. "He really was a time traveller from the year 2036, but he wasn't the first. There had been others, small incursions, temporal anomalies that we were able to contain and cover up. Titor was different because he went public. He sent that fax to Art Bell, and suddenly millions of people knew about temporal displacement." "But the timeline," Silas said. "If time travel is real, wouldn't his presence in the past have already changed things?" "That's the thing," Voss replied. "The timeline is more resilient than most people think. Small changes get absorbed, corrected by the flow of events. But major disruptions, public knowledge of time travel, that's different. That threatens the stability of the entire temporal framework." "So they killed him?" "They tried to, but Titor was smart. He knew they were coming. That's why he sent the fax to Bell. It was a dead man's switch, a way to ensure that the truth would survive even if he didn't. But it didn't survive. The broadcast was edited, the story was discredited. That's what they want you to think. But the truth has a way of persisting even when people try to erase it. That's why you found the ORPH-EUS files. That's why you're here now, talking to me." Silas was quiet for a moment, processing what she had told him. What happened to Titor? That's the question, isn't it? According to the official files, he was neutralized. But there are other files, deeper files, that suggest something different. Something that would explain why the timeline has been so unstable lately. What kind of instability? Small things. Events that don't quite line up with the historical record. People who remember things differently than they're supposed to. Temporal echoes that suggest the past is not as fixed as it should be. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small device that looked like a modified smartphone. This is a temporal resonance detector. It measures fluctuations in the time stream. Watch. She activated the device and the screen filled with a complex waveform. The pattern was chaotic, full of spikes and valleys that seemed to pulse with an organic rhythm. This is what the timeline looks like now, she said. Unstable, fractured. Something is wrong with the fundamental structure of causality itself. And you think this is connected to the Titor incident? I think John Titor didn't just travel through time. I think he broke it, and I think the people who are trying to cover it up are making it worse. She handed him the device. Take this, monitor the readings. If I'm right, if the timeline is continuing to degrade, then we need to do something about it before it's too late. What can we do? We find the truth. We find out what really happened to John Titor, and we figure out how to fix the mess that's been made of history. As if on cue, the lights in the parking garage flickered and went out. In the darkness, Silas could hear the sound of approaching footsteps, multiple sets, moving with military precision. They found us, Voss whispered. Run! The next few days blurred together in a haze of paranoia and digital archaeology. Silas had managed to escape the parking garage that night, but just barely. Dr. Voss had not been so lucky. When he looked for news of her the next morning, there was no trace, no arrest reports, no missing person filings, nothing. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist. But she had given him the tools he needed to continue the investigation. The temporal resonance detector confirmed what she had told him. The timeline was becoming increasingly unstable. The readings showed massive fluctuations, temporal distortions that seemed to be growing stronger by the day. More importantly, she had provided him with access codes to deeper levels of the Orpheus archive. Files that painted a picture of a government conspiracy that stretched back decades, involving not just the Titor incident, but a whole series of temporal anomalies that had been systematically covered up. The deeper files revealed the existence of Project Kronos, a black-budget operation that had been running since 1952. The project was tasked with monitoring and suppressing evidence of temporal displacement, but the files suggested that they had gone far beyond simple observation. They were actively manipulating the timeline, making selective alterations to history to maintain what they called narrative stability. According to the files, the Titor incident had been their greatest challenge. Unlike previous temporal anomalies, which had been private or localized, the Titor facts had been broadcast to millions of people. The normal containment protocols wouldn't work. Instead, they had implemented something called Narrative Severance Protocol, a comprehensive disinformation campaign designed to turn truth into fiction. The protocol had 3 phases. First, they would edit the original broadcast, removing the most convincing elements and replacing them with obvious fabrications. Second, they would seed false information into online forums and discussion groups, creating a confusing web of contradictory claims. Third, they would create a false Titor persona, someone who would post elaborate science fiction stories that would completely discredit the original message. The plan had worked perfectly. By 2001, when the fake John Titor began posting on internet forums, the real message had been completely obscured. The public came to know John Titor as an internet legend, a creative hoaxer who had entertained people with elaborate time travel stories. The real John Titor, the one who had sent that desperate fax to Art Bell, had been erased from history. But Silas was beginning to suspect that the story was even more complex than the files suggested. The temporal resonance detector was showing patterns that didn't match the official timeline. There were echoes, repetitions, suggestions that certain events had been repeated or revised multiple times. He decided to take a risk. Using the access codes that Dr. Voss had provided, he began to search for the deepest files in the Kronos archive. What he found made his blood run cold. The files were labelled Ouroboros Protocol, and they contained evidence of something that should have been impossible. The project wasn't just suppressing evidence of time travel, they were engaging in time travel themselves. The files contained detailed logs of temporal operations, missions to specific points in history to make selective alterations. The operations were surgical, precise, designed to change single events without disrupting the larger flow of history. But the cumulative effect was devastating. The timeline had been edited so many times that it was beginning to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. And at the centre of it all was John Titor. According to the Ouroboros files, he hadn't just travelled back in time once. He had made multiple trips, each time trying to prevent a different catastrophe, each time creating new problems that required additional interventions. The files suggested that Titor wasn't just a time traveller. He was trapped in a temporal loop, endlessly repeating the same mission, never quite achieving the results he was looking for. Each iteration of the loop created new timeline branches, new possibilities that had to be managed and contained. But the most disturbing revelation was contained in the final file labelled Subject Profile, Titor, John, real name classified. The file contained biometric data, voice print analysis, and psychological profiles. But it was the photograph that made Silas's world collapse. The face looking back at him from the screen was older, more weathered, but unmistakably familiar. It was his own face, aged by decades of impossible experience. John Titor was Silas Greer. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Everything suddenly made sense. His lifelong insomnia, his fascination with the original broadcast, his ability to access the Orpheus files. He wasn't investigating the Titor incident. He was the Titor incident. The temporal resonance detector in his pocket began to vibrate frantically. The readings were off the charts, suggesting a massive temporal event was about to occur. Around him, reality began to shimmer and distort, as if the fabric of time itself was coming apart. He understood now why the timeline was so unstable. His presence in the past was creating paradoxes, contradictions that the universe was struggling to resolve. Every time he learned more about his own future, he created new branches, new possibilities that had to be managed and contained. The government agents who had been hunting him weren't trying to stop him from revealing the truth. They were trying to prevent him from completing the loop, from becoming the John Titor who would send that fax to Art Bell. But it was too late. The loop was already closing. He could feel it, the pull of destiny, the weight of events that had already been set in motion. In that moment, he understood that he had never had a choice. He had been following a script that had been written decades ago, playing out a role that had been predetermined by the laws of causality itself. His last act was to upload everything he had discovered to a series of encrypted servers, hidden in the deep corners of the internet. The files would survive, even if he didn't. Someone else would find them. Someone else would piece together the truth. He typed a final message, his fingers moving with the certainty of someone who had written these same words countless times before. The 5100 was a tool. The broadcast was the ignition. I didn't travel time, I broke it. And now I see everything. The loop was me. As he hit send, the world dissolved around him, reality collapsing into a single point of impossible light. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was his own reflection in the computer screen, but it was different now. Older, wearier, bearing the weight of knowledge that no human mind should have to carry. John Titor was gone. Silas Greer was gone. But the loop continued, as it always had, as it always would. Somewhere in the multiverse, a 10-year-old boy was lying in bed, listening to Art Bell read a fax from a time traveller who claimed to be from the year 2036. The message would always be the same. The warning would always be ignored, and the loop would always close. Time, it seemed, was not a river flowing in one direction. It was a circle, endlessly repeating, endlessly consuming itself. And at the centre of that circle, a voice called out across the years, desperate and urgent and forever unheard. Don't trust the timeline, it's being rewritten. In the end, that was all that remained. The echo of a voice that had been erased from history, the ghost of a man who had tried to change the past and had only succeeded in ensuring that it would happen exactly as it always had. The Titor files would be discovered eventually, pieced together by someone else who couldn't sleep, someone else who heard voices in the static. The truth would surface, as it always did, but it would be dismissed as fiction, as fantasy, as the delusions of someone who had spent too long staring into the abyss of classified information. And somewhere in the darkness between one moment and the next, between one timeline and another, the loop would continue, eternal and inescapable, a temporal Ouroboros devouring its own tail. The listener had remembered. The listener had become the message, and the message would always be the same.